A system designed to protect individual liberty will have no punishments for any group and no privileges. Today, I think inner city folks and minorities are punished unfairly in the war on drugs. For instance, blacks make up 14% of those who use drugs, yet 36% of those arrested are blacks, and it ends up that 63% of those who finally end up in prison are blacks. This has to change. We don't have to have more courts and more prisons. We need to repeal the whole war on drugs. It isn't working. We have already spent over $400 billion since the early 70s.
As more and more begin to know the status quo has got to go, they're bound to say yes to a man named Dr. No. A man who makes the establishment panic. Grassroots are growing way too wild, too organic. With no donations from Goldman Sachs, they're still having trouble trying to hold them back. But it's not about a man, am I clear? It's about a man who will carry on an idea. The script you've been given doesn't fit, it's a given. Dr. Paul has been robbed in every state he has been in. It's a sin when the teleprompter readers keep spinning, having the people believing Dr. Paul isn't winning. The smear campaign is wearing off fast. Exponentially, we are tearing off masks. The mass media ain't making it fair. Once we kill the central bank, we can take it from there. Paul, he's a statesman, so why do they hate him? He was delivering babies back in 1963, and he just helped give birth to the baby of liberty. He's a statesman, so why do they hate him? He was delivering speeches back in 1984, telling you how central banks were profiting from war.
I believe in the death penalty. I believe it has been issued unjustly. If you're rich, you get away with it. If you're poor and you're from the inner city, you're more likely to be prosecuted and convicted. And
as the bobbleheads tell you, Congressman Paul is unelectable. That's true when you approach it from a technical angle, because the media is being strangled, giving opinions of people as they fandangle. It takes two to tango and play the game. Thus, the people are just as much to blame. The two parties should be fired and flamed, cause they're owned by the same cabal I won't name. Vote fraud's been proven by all reason. Tamper with the ballot, that's beyond all treason. Campaign season is but a comedy. The winner is the one who used bombs to spread democracy. They promise change and proceed to trounce your hopes. How can your vote count when criminals count the votes? Their funny money make the cluster bombs fall. That will cease if you demand Congressman Ron Paul.
So Dmitry Medvedev, he's the deputy chair of the Russian Security Council. He said Sunday that if Ukraine's struggling counteroffensive was successful, Russia would have to use nuclear weapons. So he wrote on Twitter, quote, "By repelling the collective enemy's counteroffensive, our armed forces are defending Russian citizens and our land. It is quite clear to all decent people. Besides that, they are preventing global conflict," end quote. Medvedev said that if Ukraine's counteroffensive was successful and they took away part of Russia's land, that Russia would have to use nuclear weapons. And he referred to Russia's nuclear doctrine, which allows the use of nukes if Russia feels its existence is threatened. He said, quote, "There would simply be no other way out. That's why our enemies must worship our warriors. They are keeping global nuclear fire from flaring up," end quote. So throughout the war, Medvedev has been very hawkish in his rhetoric, pretty over the top, but I still think it's important to highlight that you have a Russian official here saying, if Ukraine is going to win, by the West's by its own definition and by what the West's definition is, I guess, as well, that means, we're going to use nukes. And I think it's just important to highlight that because it goes to show how much more important this war is to Russia than the US and NATO. Saudi Arabia to host Ukraine talks, what they're calling Ukraine peace talks, except Russia's not going to be there. So this article is from Kyle Anzalone at the Libertarian Institute. Saudi officials have invited diplomats from 30 countries, to attend talks on the Ukraine war in early August. While it is unclear which countries will send a representative to Jeddah, Saudi Arabia did not extend an invitation to Russia. So Riyadh hopes that officials from up to 30 countries, including the US, Ukraine, India, Brazil, Indonesia, Egypt, Mexico, Chile, and Zambia, will attend the talks slated for August 5th and 6th. So those are, a few of the major non-aligned countries. And really, the whole idea of this summit that they're trying to, call peace talks. If you see the reports in this, in the Wall Street Journal, Saudi Arabia hosting Ukraine peace talks. I got excited when I saw it. I thought, oh, wow, are Russia and Ukraine going to talk? No, they're not. And the point of this, what the U.S. and its allies want to do is try to convince these countries to, side more with Ukraine and adopt Ukraine's demands for an end to the war, which is a full Russian withdrawal, which is really, a non-starter for peace talks. So this is certainly not conducive to peace. That's just the reality. It doesn't really matter how you feel about what Russia's doing in Ukraine. The reality is the demands for a complete Russian withdrawal, which includes Crimea, is just a non-starter for peace talks. Secretary of State Antony Blinken on Saturday rejected Australia's concerns about WikiLeaks founder and Australian citizen Julian Assange, who faces up to 175 years in prison if extradited to the U.S. and convicted for exposing U.S. war crimes. So Blinken was in Australia with Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin to discuss bolstering military ties between the U.S. and Australia. At a press conference during the visit, Australian Foreign Minister Penny Wong said Canberra has made clear to Washington that it wants the U.S. to drop its case against Assange. She said, quote, "We have made clear our view that Mr. Assange's case has dragged on for too long and our desire that it be brought to a conclusion. And we've said that publicly, and you would anticipate that that reflects also the position we articulate in private," end quote. So Blinken was there and he confirmed that the issue has been discussed but rejected Australia's concerns. He said Australia must recognize the U.S.'s position on Assange, claiming the WikiLeaks founder's alleged actions risked very serious harm to national security. Blinken said, quote, "Mr. Assange was charged with a very serious criminal conduct in the United States in connection with his alleged role in one of the largest compromises of classified information in the history of our country. So I say that only because just as we understand sensitivities here, it's important that our friends understand sensitivities in the United States," end quote. So Assange has been indicted under the Espionage Act by the U.S. Justice Department related to documents WikiLeaks published that it obtained from former Army Private Chelsea Manning. But Assange obtained that material using standard journalistic practices. And if he's convicted in the U.S., it would set a very grave precedent for press freedom. Niger coup leader joins line of U.S.-trained mutineers. So this is from Nick Turse at The Intercept, and he is confirming that one of the Niger coup leaders was trained by the U.S., and that is Brigadier General Moussa Salahu Barmou. He's the chief of Niger's Special Operations Forces and one of the leaders of the unfolding coup in Niger. He was trained by the U.S. military, and The Intercept has confirmed that. U.S.-trained military officers have taken part in 11 coups in West Africa since 2008. And in 2021, Barmou said that Niger had a very long relationship with the U.S., and it's good to work with them. And just last month, he met with Lieutenant General Jonathan Braga, who's the head of U.S. Army Special Operations Command at Air Base 201, which is this big drone base in the Nigerian city of Agadez, and that serves as the linchpin of an archipelago of U.S. outposts in West Africa. He did not return phone calls or text messages from The Intercept. So a U.S. official tracking the coup confirmed Barmou's relationship with the U.S. military and said that he was probably not alone, basically saying we're going to learn that more of these coup leaders were trained by the U.S. Again, the U.S. is very involved in Niger, has about 1,100 troops and this big drone base. And so far right now, the situation with the coup, the EU suspended aid. The U.S. is threatening to suspend aid to Niger. So we'll see how it plays out. So again, just because, these military officers were trained by the U.S., that doesn't mean that this is like a U.S.-backed or orchestrated coup. It just goes to show how, because a lot of times after these coups, the governments, kind of turn away from the U.S. and become more friendly to Russia. And it just kind of shows what a failure of policy this whole counterterrorism strategy in Africa is. And Turse puts the numbers in again, just staggering numbers. In 2002 and 2003, there were 9 terrorist attacks in Africa. And that's when the U.S. started giving this counterterrorism support to Niger. So 9 attacks in those 2 years. Last year, there was 2,737 in just Burkina Faso, Mali, and Western Niger alone. So complete abysmal failure. And that's U.S. That's the terror wars. That's what it is. Complete failure.
The Peter Schiff Show.
But I think that big rally in the market created a sense of comfort for the Fed that, we could slip in another rate hike. And in fact, going into the decision, the odds of a rate hike were near 100%. So, of course, by then, I was pretty much of the view that we were going to get a hike. I no longer believed that the Fed was done, because one thing I've learned over the years is the Fed never wants to surprise the market. So if the market is certain the Fed's going to hike, well, the Fed hikes. The Fed doesn't want to surprise the market, disappoint the market, give the market a reason to be concerned. After all, if the Fed didn't hike, the markets might have thought, why not? Why didn't they hike? What's the problem? What are they worried about that we don't know about? So when the markets are kind of blessing the rate hike because everybody believes the Fed is going to hike, and then the markets are going up anyway, there's no reason for the Fed not to hike because it can kind of get it in. But the question is, what's going to happen next? Because Powell is still indicating that there's one more hike, but that's really it. And whether or not we go from 5.25, 5.5 to 5.5, 5.75, I don't think that really makes much of a difference. But it's pretty clear from what Powell said, not only in the prepared remarks, but in the press conference that followed, that this is pretty much it. Because Powell mentioned in that Q&A that they don't expect any rate cuts this year. Well, I mean, the year is half over, right? I mean, we're, next week we're starting August. And so the fact that we're not going to get any cuts this year shouldn't surprise anyone. But what Powell did indicate is that the members of the FOMC believe that the rate cuts are going to start next year in 2024. So I think that's pretty dovish to let that cat out of the bag, that we're going to start cutting rates in 2024. And, it doesn't even make any sense for the Fed to even suggest that rate cuts could come as early as next year, when the Fed also removed from their forecast a mild recession. The last time the Fed met, they had a recession in their forecast, which is something they never do. Now, they kind of clarified it by forecasting a mild recession, but they still forecast a recession. They've now changed their mind. According to Powell, based on the economic data that has come out since that forecast, the economy now looks strong enough that the Fed's base case is now a soft landing where the economy avoids recession. We don't even have a recession, and we don't even have any kind of big pickup in unemployment. Well, if that is really the case, if the Fed thinks there's no recession anywhere in sight, and according to Powell, we're still a long way from reaching the 2% inflation goal. He said many times that inflation is still too high. It's a threat. It is, eroding purchasing power. It is hurting the middle class. It's hurting the poor. We're a long way from victory. Given that, if we're a long way from achieving the inflation goal, and the economy is now so strong that they're not even worried about a recession, why would they talk about rate cuts as early as next year? Also, I think the most significant announcement that came out of the meeting is that Powell admitted that the Fed is not going to wait for 2% inflation before it starts cutting rates, because Powell said we don't believe we're going to get back to 2% inflation until sometime in 2025. But he said the Fed is forecasting the first rate cuts to happen in 2024. Well, why cut rates if you're still not at your 2% goal? Well, what Powell tried to say is that we don't have to wait for 2%. We will just assume that if we've made enough progress and we're moving in that direction, well, we'll just start cutting rates anyway. And we'll just assume that the prior rate hikes have got us on a glide path so that we can still get down to 2%, even if we start cutting rates, which makes no sense. In fact, Powell admitted that the Fed is still restrictive in its policy, but that by next year, it may not only move to neutral, but move to accommodative. He said we may lower interest rates to below neutral next year. How are they going to do that? We're not even close to the inflation goal. Yes, if you look at the headline CPI, we got down to 3%, but it's not going to stay there. Oil prices dropped almost 50% between, I think, the summer of 2021 and about 3 months ago. It was about a 50% drop in oil prices. That was really what brought headline CPI down from 9% to 3%. Well, over the last 3 months or so, oil prices are up 25%. We closed the fifth consecutive positive week for oil. We closed above $80 a barrel. Gasoline prices now in the country are at the highest they've been all year. We're seeing other commodities that have already turned. The dollar index is weakening. It's bounced, it's back up to about 101, but the dollar is in a decisive downtrend. Everything that you're looking at, all these forward indicators suggest that inflation is going to get worse, not better. These big banks, they got no problem with taking politicians. So they took the Bidens and all these accounts. They filed over the course of, I'm not sure how many years, 170 suspicious activity reports. Those are called SARs on the Bidens. That means the bank saw something suspicious in the transaction and notified the government. Hey, look, we're worried about this transaction in this account. The government did nothing. Now, you could see, okay, maybe 1 or 2 SARs, no big deal. 170 on the same group of accounts and nothing? I mean, what is the point of requiring banks to file these suspicious activity reports if you don't even look into them? They must have looked into them. Somebody at the Justice Department, somebody somewhere must have looked into these SARs and saw that they were linked to these Biden-related accounts, and so they did nothing. Here's the irony. None of these big banks, despite filing all of these SARs, none of these banks closed any of the Biden's accounts. They just let them keep on banking. Even though they were doing all this suspicious stuff, they kept the account open. They kept processing all these suspicious transactions. All they did is tell the government that they're doing it, and they figured, okay, we covered our butts, but they continued to bank these LLCs. Now, contrast that to what my bank would have done. We would have shut the account down. We wouldn't have just continued to bank them. We got a lot of SARs that we filed, but we always shut the account down. We didn't want to take a chance. And again, the government wasted, the U.S. government wasted 2 years, spent all kinds of money looking for evidence that my bank was helping people launder money and evade taxes and found nothing. At the same time, they were handed a pile of evidence on a silver platter that the Bidens were actually evading taxes and laundering money, and they did nothing. So here I am, innocent, was punished. I lost my entire bank, and absolutely nothing has happened to Joe Biden or Hunter Biden or anybody in the Biden clan, despite the fact that there's overwhelming evidence of guilt.
I always predict it'll end because we'll run out of money. But there's a race right now. Which is going to be the biggest? Money for our militarism, or the money we're paying for borrowing the money for our militarism?
Really.
And we're at the point now where the interest on the payments to run this foreign policy is growing faster, and it will be the big thing. So I think everybody has their favorite things to look at for the economy, and the economists have a lot of different things they do just to distract. They never look much at the Federal Reserve. But I think if you have one item to look at, if you could get an accurate measurement of real debt, they can hide debt and obligations, all these different things. But if you know what the real debt is, that will be the limiting factor, because ultimately, even though it should have really challenged the dollar already, it's constantly challenging the dollar, because that means prices are going up. Yeah. And so that's the case. So we'll be watching that at least. But I just thought today, Daniel, this is a big bill. It's related so much to what we try to do and get information out. But I would say the vote, which was 86-11, we didn't do a very good job. But I still am optimistic that if the people really knew what was going on and really knew what was going on in our foreign policy, they'd have a different attitude.
When I think of this bill, is sleepwalking, because they continue to go on pretending as if we're absolutely the top dog. Our empire is unchallenged. Spending a little bit more money will shore up our empire. And in the meantime, as we see now, increasingly, our weapons, our training, everything that we spend the money on that actually should defend us, we're seeing it fail before our eyes in Ukraine. And so you're wondering, where is this money going? What's happening to it? The other thing, and I'll put on that first one if you can, the other thing about this that struck me is it's so classic DC. Because you remember, we talked about it on this show, the big deal about the budget ceiling, the spending ceiling, all this and that. Well, the debt ceiling deal, okay? That was going to really save us. So even though this bill authorizes a record $886 billion in military spending, well, that's okay, because that was the agreement set in the debt ceiling talks, 886, so that within that. But as Dave DeCamp points out from Antiwar.com, this is the little loophole, Dr. Paul. Hawks in Congress, and that would be both parties, are planning to increase that figure even more by passing, quote, emergency supplemental funding, which is not limited by the debt ceiling deal. And you would say, absolutely. I mean, if we're in an emergency, who can deny them funding? Who can count how many emergencies there are?
There's always going to be one, and that's why that whole pseudo-debate had very little meaning.
Yeah.
But in spite of all this negative talk on our program today, the vote in the House was a little bit better. It was 219 to 210 when it passed the House. So that means, and they are closer to the people than I think the Senate, generally speaking. So they're getting the message, and I think they're feeling it harder. The average person of their pocketbook. I think they are catching on that when we're shipping so much money outside and we're having so many more problems here. If you listen to the president, he talks pretty good. Things don't seem to be that bad,
Bidenomics.
But the people aren't buying into that, so that's going to continue continue, and we will, of course, point out a couple things that, where we have pretty good evidence that you shouldn't be overly optimistic. You already have one. The debt limit doesn't even do any protecting, and they can always cancel.
So an amendment introduced by Senator Rand Paul to require audits and investigations of Ukraine aid failed in a vote of 70 to 28, with only Republicans supporting the measure. So every single Democrat voted against any kind of audit on this. The Senate also rejected an amendment to establish a lead inspector general for Ukraine in a vote of 51 to 48. Now this was interesting because there was a procedural move in the Senate because they knew they were going to lose this to require a 3/5 majority on this rather than a simple majority. So on that second one, I think it was good because Senator Paul came very, very close to getting that inspector general, which you have to ask, why don't you want to know where the money's going? Why don't you want to know?
Well, I don't think they want to know. Well, they might know, but they have to know that to hide it. They just don't want the people to know what's going on. But I think that's where it's inevitable. They will wake up and they'll have to figure out that it has to be related to what the government is doing, and that spending is a big deal. The big issue, though, why that logic doesn't work, is that everybody has been conditioned over many, many decades to see what they get from the government as being very legitimate, and it's theirs, and you have other places where you're supposed to cut.
Good tweet on Senator Paul's amendments, if we can put that next one up. And I was just searching around. It's Nick Sorter. I don't know him. Apparently he's been published, whatever, but whatever the case, he has a good tweet. He says the U.S. Senate once again blocked Senator Paul's effort to require audits and investigations of the tens of billions that the U.S. taxpayer has given to Ukraine. You could say probably 150 billion, actually. He continues, this comes just 1 month after the Pentagon's $6.2 billion, quote, accounting error on Ukrainian aid. Yet the majority of both Democrats and Republicans still refuse to provide oversight. As a reminder, just last year, the Senate passed a bill to hire 87,000 new IRS agents in order to deeply dig into the finances of everyday Americans. You can't audit the money being printed for Ukraine. Why do you think Congress won't allow Ukrainian aid to be audited? And I love this because he says, yeah, they'll audit every single one of us and hire 80,000 to do it, but they won't audit this $150 billion to Ukraine.
But, I think we lose twice. So, of course, they take the money, they buy this and say, we have to send more weapons. Military-industrial complex has to have a life too, So they do that and send the weapons. But then it's not over. Does it do what they claim it's going to do and bring about victory? No, things get worse over there. And
U.S. announces $345 million in unprecedented military aid for Taiwan. So some of this money being spent is spent to poke China, try to get China to react, try to get China to do something tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of miles from the U.S. We've got to get Taiwan ready for war with China. This is where the money goes.
Yes, and this is a belief. They think that money can solve all the problems that they create. But the biggest thing is they started from a philosophy of it's great to have an American empire.
Yeah.
I mean, they wouldn't call it that, but it's America's need, to spread our wonderful message of democracy and freedom and liberty. And it nauseates me when I thought I would have to listen to some of those members of Congress talk, and it sounded so wonderful.
Oh, yeah.
But it was all just a con game. And the system that we operate with and all this stuff is really a con game. So often it's painted in a picture of patriotism. If you don't do it, you're not a very good patriot. And what we really need more is maybe a little bit more common sense.
Why do we sit down when all should be standing? And why do we back down at the critical moment, like running away from the waves of the ocean? We head for the hills with the high tide approaching, as sand slips away from the castle. When it's time to stand upright, why do we falter, like placing our freedom on the sacrificial altar? We hold tight to our fears and defend our oppressors as we fight for their lives and become the transgressors. As pacifists transform to violent aggressors. But I'm only a stranger here. I'm a long, long way from my home. And they say I can't change all the things I find strange. For what what can one man do alone? They say, what can one man do alone? When is the right time to stand up for freedom? Could it be when you start to feel creating children who'll inherit the pain and the debt of this nation and be slaves to the banks that cause hyperinflation, who are masters of commerce, lies, and bad legislation? Whoa, if you looked in the eyes of 1,000 young children through fences of razors, their innocence stolen as the red flag of tyranny flies in the open, is that when you finally notice? Whoa, but I'm only a stranger here. I'm a long, long way from my home, and they say I can't change all the things I find strange. For what can one man do alone? Is what can one man do alone? I'm only a stranger looking to find better nature in my fellow man, but they keep telling me it's a sin to be free, and that's more than I'm willing to stand. Where will you be when the order is given to censor your mind as free speech is forbidden, as martyrs for peace from the world will be driven away by the sound of a bellowing thunder and choke on the blood of a dream going under? As arrogant men tear up our Constitution, and from every direction we cry revolution, standing together and without permission, soldiers for truth in the war of attrition, the love of our country as our ammunition. Oh, but I'm only a stranger here. I'm a long, long way from my home, and I'm going to change all the things I find strange, for I am not one man alone. Yes, I'm only a stranger. I'm a long, long way from my home, and I'm going to change all the things I find strange, for I know that I'm not alone. Yes, I know I'm not alone. Not alone.
Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the weekly report. Facebook files reveal despicable disregard for the Constitution. Last week's revelation that Facebook took orders from the Biden administration to censor even accurate information about COVID is the latest example of the U.S. government's disregard for our Constitution. Thanks to Representative Jim Jordan, chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, we now know the extent to which the Biden administration went in its proxy war against the First Amendment. Getting the information wasn't easy. It was only after Facebook founder Mark Zuckerberg was threatened with being held in contempt of Congress that he relented and shared information with the Judiciary Committee about Biden administration pressure to censor Americans on Facebook who disagreed with White House policy on COVID. What we have discovered thus far is disgusting. For example, in April 2021, a Facebook employee sent a message to top executives in the company explaining that we are facing continued pressure from external stakeholders, including the Biden White House, to remove posts. In another example, senior executive Nick Clegg complained that Andy Slavitt, a senior advisor to President Biden, was outraged that if Facebook did not remove a particular post, according to Representative Jordan's report. Representative Jordan revealed that the offending post that the Biden administration wanted removed was simply a joke making fun of possible vaccine injury down the road. The Biden administration even wanted to protect us from jokes that it didn't like. The administration did not stop at targeting what is called misinformation. As constitutional law professor Jonathan Turley noted in a recent column, the administration also demanded the removal of malinformation that is based on fact, but used out of context to mislead, harm, or manipulate. So the Biden administration wanted to cancel even truthful information counter to its own preferred narrative. This level of contempt for our Constitution is shocking. As Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who was himself censored at the behest of the Biden administration, testified recently before Congress, a government that can censor its critics has license for every atrocity. It is the beginning of totalitarianism. Who knows how many thousands of Facebook accounts were banned or restricted at the behest of the Biden administration. Early last year, I received notice that my own Facebook page was restricted for 90 days because I pointed out that the CEO of Pfizer once claimed that his COVID shot was 100% effective, but later changed his story. The post was completely accurate, but still, my page was targeted. Although some are using this information for partisan gain against the Democrats in power, Americans should not delude themselves. Left unchecked, there is little reason to believe a Republican administration would show any more respect for the Constitution than the Biden administration. Both parties have shown themselves to be selective in their pledged oath to uphold and defend the U.S. Constitution. It is just as unconstitutional and thus illegal for the U.S. government to violate the First Amendment by proxy through so-called private companies, as if the government directly attacked our freedom of speech. We must remember that the unprecedented U.S. government censorship of Americans during COVID was just the test run. Be assured that when the next crisis comes, and it will, the authoritarians in charge will again ramp up the censorship machine unless we do something about it. Thanks for listening.
So Mexico's President Andrés Manuel López Obrador said Monday that his country would attend talks on Ukraine that are set to be held in Saudi Arabia this weekend only if Russia is invited. He said, quote, "If there's acceptance from both Ukraine and Russia to look for solutions to achieve peace, we'll participate. We don't want the Russia-Ukraine war to continue. It's very irrational. The only thing that benefits from it is the war industry." End quote. So while this is being billed as peace talks, Russia has not been invited to the summit in Saudi Arabia. Nations that are not aligned with the US and NATO on the war have been invited, including India, Brazil, and China, but it's not clear at this point which countries will attend. They invited about 30 nations to attend this summit. And the idea here is for Ukraine and its Western backers to use the summit to try and convince non-aligned nations to adopt Kiev's demands for peace, which include a full Russian withdrawal from all the territory that's been captured, and that is currently a non-starter for negotiations with Moscow. Ukraine is also demanding that Russia cede Crimea, which has been controlled by Moscow since 2014, and is populated by people who are happy that they are part of the Russian Federation. For their part, Russia insists that any future peace deal must recognize the territory it has annexed in Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporozhye. And that demonstrates how far apart these two sides are when it comes to peace talks. So in an op-ed published by Newsweek, former President Donald Trump said that the Russiagate conspiracy was a coup attempt that led to the war in Ukraine. Trump warned the Russophobia hysteria created by the conspiracy theory could start World War III. Trump said, quote, "An unelected cabal in the senior ranks of our government, in concert with their chosen candidate, Hillary Clinton, and their allies in the media, launched the de facto coup attempt known as the Russia hoax. Their goal was to prevent my election, and failing that, to throw me out of office or sabotage my presidency, undercut my agenda in Congress, block my domestic reforms, and interfere with my foreign policy," end quote. Trump references the report compiled by John Durham that vindicates his claim that Russiagate was a conspiracy invented by his political opposition. Another Trump claim, bolstered by the Durham report, is that the American intelligence community wrongfully pursued the investigation into ties between his campaign and the Kremlin. Trump identified that the conspiracy theory impacted Russia policy. He said, quote, "At a critical moment when we should have been reducing tensions with Russia, the Russia hoax stoked mass hysteria that helped drive Russia straight into the arms of China. Instead of having a better relationship with Russia as I worked to build, we now have a proxy war with Russia, fueled in part by the lingering fumes of Russiagate delirium, end quote. So Kyle explains that Trump is seeking to solely blame those who pushed the Russiagate hoax for the destruction of U.S. relations. But as president, Trump took a very aggressive stance against Moscow, and certainly Russiagate has a lot to do with that. He was definitely under pressure to be hawkish toward Russia, but it's we can't forget that he was very hawkish toward Russia, tearing up major arms control treaties, the INF and Open Skies. He was the first one to send missiles to Ukraine, so there was already, a proxy war going on at a much smaller scale. So we can't forget that history. But it's going to be an interesting election season. I mean, I don't know. Things are going to get pretty crazy, I think. But just when it comes to the back and forth about the war in Ukraine, because right now it seems like Trump is the front runner for the Republicans. So it's going to be interesting. The U.S. wants a multinational force to intervene in Haiti. So this is another one from Kyle at the Libertarian Institute. Washington plans to introduce a resolution at the United Nations Security Council to authorize sending soldiers to Haiti. The Caribbean country has fallen into chaos after President Jovenel Moise was assassinated over 2 years ago. The White House has been seeking a country to lead the multinational force for months and appears to have enlisted Kenya to serve that role. State Department spokesperson Matthew Miller said that the U.S. and Ecuador planned to introduce the resolution at the Security Council to authorize the deployment in the coming days. Miller indicated that more steps need to be taken before Kenyan troops arrive in Haiti. He said, quote, "The second step is that the government of Kenya needs to conduct an assessment mission, which they plan to do in the coming days and weeks. We are committed to finding the resources to support this multinational force," end quote. So Washington has spent several months seeking a country to send their soldiers to Haiti. In October, American officials wanted Canada to take on the role, but Ottawa rejected Washington's demands. So Kenya leading the mission could pose an issue, as its soldiers are known to commit human rights abuses. Foreign intervention in Haiti has a very, very dark history. There was a very chaotic UN intervention, and UN, what they call peacekeepers, lots of rights abuses, lots of rape and things like that. So just a really dark history. And from how I understand it, the people of Haiti don't want, foreign intervention. They definitely want an end to a lot of the violence that's happening. But, again, just this dark history of U.S. and UN intervention there. I mentioned here, I always have to put this in from Nick Terse over at The Intercept, just explaining, the complete failure that U.S. counterterrorism policy has been in Africa. In 2002 and 2003, the U.S. Counted just 9 terrorist attacks in all of Africa. And last year, just in a few countries in the West Africa there was 2,737 terrorist attacks. Complete and utter failure. But the U.S. does not want to leave, so that's why I wouldn't be surprised if they really back some sort of military intervention. This is from Gallup, and it's based on a Gallup poll. Americans are now less likely to express a great deal or quite a lot of confidence in the U.S. military, with a noticeable decline that has persisted for the past 5 years. The latest numbers are from a June 1st to 22nd Gallup poll that also captured record lows in public confidence in several public institutions. So if you see this chart here, this is U.S. confidence in the military, and it shot up in the 90s and shot up, after 9/11, then went down and up, and now it's been steadily declining for the past 5 years or so. So at 60%, confidence in the military was last this low in 1997, and it hasn't been lower since 1988, when 58% were confident. 60% still seems kind of high to me. But yeah, I just thought that was interesting. So if you want to go check out the details of that poll.
You run your mouth and I run my business, brother. You tell everybody I'm busted. You talk so much you got me disgusted. But you run your mouth and I run my business, brother.
But as far as threats, what we do know from the Twitter files is that the government was making threats. We also know this from the depositions in Missouri versus Biden. The threats were, if you don't do this, there may be antitrust action against you. These were overt threats, and this is what's going to make this case so strong. When this gets to the Supreme Court, I think that the free speech advocates are going to win. This is a lawsuit began by Senator Eric Schmidt when he was the Attorney General. But I think the evidence is pretty strong that there were threats. There were threats of antitrust action against the companies if they didn't take the material down. There was also threats of, we will remove your 230 protection. Section 230 gives them liability protection, and they were overt threats and threats in writing, basically saying, if you don't take this down, your 230 protection of liability.
We're going to pause it there. You guys can go watch the rest of this if you're interested. I think it's pretty clear what happened over the last couple of years and the amount of censorship that exists in the social media platforms. I think it's pretty clear. We even heard Jen Psaki. She said it live on TV that they were, I forget the exact turn of phrase, but that they were talking to social media companies. We heard Mark Zuckerberg, when he was on the Joe Rogan podcast, describe, oh yeah, we felt pressure to act in a certain way. I think it's pretty obvious. And I think we know that what government will do. If you're in business and you've got the ability to pressure people to only put out the good information about you, you're always going to do that. And so if you're the person with the monopoly on violence and you're the most powerful player in the game and you're running your business and you've got certain policy agendas that are good for your business, such as pretending like the money you're spending is actually helping everyone, pretending like the inflation is just temporary, pretending like you have no control over the oil prices, I mean, you're just walking towards dictatorship. And so we can all understand that obviously you don't want to give that kind of power to government. This just makes sense. But then you get the people who will pretend like the implication that government would abuse its power is unproven. But that's exactly what the issue is if you allow government to be snaky and apply intimidation without actually breaking the law of wink, wink, nod, nod. Hey, we'd really appreciate if you did this. We all know, what does that mean when the government calls you up and goes, hey, we'd really appreciate if you did this? It obviously means that they're probably going to make your life a little bit more difficult if you don't oblige them, and it will be a lot easier if you do oblige them. Well, I don't think Sam Bankman-Fried has gotten totally off, but for some reason, and we're working off headlines more than usual on this episode, but there's good information here, everybody, and feel free to go fact check me. And you probably aren't even aware of these stories. Now you can go Google them, so you're welcome. I just helped you out. But he's being let off for, I guess, the campaign donation fraud, which sounds like a good way to make sure that the politicians are uninvolved in any of these investigations and get to keep the money. Like all the other stuff's on the table, but the thing that kind of included that a lot of the money went to the politicians and might have been stolen money, well, you're not guilty on that one because then we might be guilty of taking the funds. So, why don't we look into all the other bad stuff that you did? Trying to describe Ron DeSantis and why I think he's a deep state character. And that's in part because of the time he sent and Gitmo. And I was very bold because I'd been having a conversation the night before with Scott Horton where, I'd laid out my theory. And that's the problem. Like Scott, he actually knows all this information. You can talk to Scott. He knows all of it. He knows all of it. And then you get emboldened because you were just hanging out with him and he knows all of it. And then you realize, well, he's not sitting right here. Oh, I'm not prepared for this conversation at all. And then the conversation that was on Bill Maher about this is why we need a domestic terrorism title. And I see an organization that is willing, not just willing, I see them as like another branch of the news. I'm not talking about the entire FBI, but there's some unit in the FBI that goes, hey, we need news stories that showcases the threats that we're claiming exist so that we can have the budget to go police those threats. And if they could, I've said this before, people like me would probably be in jail. Hey, that's a domestic terrorist with no rights, and they've been spreading misinformation that would get in the way of us being able to create more news stories and trap more people and then have budget to go police more like-minded individuals. So here you go, the actual receipts, because otherwise this just sounds like stupid conspiracy theories. Judge orders release of 3 of Newburgh 4 criticizing FBI. Judge Colleen McMahon of U.S. District Court suggested that the federal agency had invented a conspiracy. A federal judge on Thursday ordered the compassionate release of 3 Hudson Valley men who were a part of a group known as the Newburgh 4 after finding that the FBI agents had used an unscrupulous operative to persuade them to join a plot to blow up synagogues and bring down military planes more than a decade ago. The decision by Judge Colleen McMahon of United States District Court in Manhattan was scathing in its description of the methods used by the FBI in its pursuit of the 3 Onta Williams, Lagarde Payne, and David Williams, calling the plot in which they were convicted of participating in 2010 an FBI-orchestrated conspiracy. A person reading the crimes and conviction in this case would be left with the impression that the offending defendants were sophisticated international terrorists committed to jihad against the United States, Judge McMahon wrote. However, they were in actual reality hapless, easily manipulated, and penurious, petty criminals. Under the judge's orders, Onta Williams, David Williams, and Mr. Payne's sentences will be reduced to time served plus 90 days. They were sentenced in 2011 to at least 25 years in prison. During the trial, a 4th defendant, James Cormity, was presented as being a key player in the plot, though Judge McMahon seemed most aggrieved by Saeed Hussein, a longtime FBI informant. He later became infamous as the owner of a down-market limousine company that rented a defective vehicle to a group of partygoers in 2018, leading to 20 deaths. In the Newburgh case, this last paragraph I'll read, you guys can read the rest of this on your own. Judge McMahon wrote that Mr. Hussein, whom Sheen described as a most unsavory, had lured Mr. Cormite in 2007 with promises of both heavenly and earthly rewards, including as much as $250,000 if he would plan and participate and find others to participate in a jihadist mission. After waffling for months, Mr. Cormite recruited the other 3 defendants, though none had any history as terrorists, instead were impoverished small-time grifters and drug users / street-level dealers who could use some money. The 3 men were recruited so that Cormite could conspire with someone, she wrote. The real lead conspirator was the United States. Last paragraph. Their plan, encouraged and orchestrated by Mr. Hussein, was to bomb Jewish sites in the Bronx and fire Stinger missiles at military planes at Stewart Airport near Newburgh, New York. Bombs were in fact left outside 2 synagogues in the Riverdale section of the Bronx, but they were fakes built by the FBI. And I remember this. I remember when the story came out. I'd be like, holy shit, the FBI, they stopped people that were going to bomb synagogues. Holy shit, this thing is real. Maybe I don't remember that, and I'm just saying that now because it's convenient while I'm reading the article. But there you go. This was something I talked about more than once. And then remember a couple weeks ago when I said, keep your retarded kids away from the FBI because he had that kid that they had send them like $25 as if he was going to go to ISIS. And they called the FBI to try and rat out the FBI for trying to recruit people. And then he ended up getting sentenced to jail time. So this has been a long running conspiracy theory of mine that the government will in fact, I'm sorry, I get distracted. And Nibs is funny. He said, I'm going to email Rob and tell him I'm gay. I can respect that. This has been a long-running conspiracy theory of mine that the government will, specifically the FBI, create its own news so that, you know, it can pretend that threats exist and then strip us of our freedoms in order to police those threats that it was able to create news about to say existed. And here, to me, New York Times, federal judge seems to confirm that at least in that story, and the truth always comes out when it's too late. Once they get their agenda passed and it's irrelevant, that's when the truth comes out. That's why when whatever the fuck they were doing and trying to police terrorism in the United States of America, trying to push for tapping phone lines and whatnot, now that it's irrelevant, the truth can come out and these people don't have to sit in jail anymore. But as long as it's still relevant information, oh, we're going to need 57 years before we can release any of the COVID data. Sure, we can get approved in 2 months, but to share that data would take 57 years to share all that data.
Well, I think there's two forms of major forms of slavery in this country. When the government makes the assumption that they own every penny you earn, and you're allowed to keep the amount that they want you to keep under their conditions, I call that about as close to economic slavery as you can get. But that's not the one I want to talk about. It was a different type of slavery that's been around for thousands of years probably. And I have a family story that was told that my grandfather left Germany when he was 14 and came over here by himself. Yikes. And the whispers in the family was he was escaping the draft. So
good for
maybe
him.
that's where I got some of those instincts. But this whole thing about reinstituting the draft, I think is a form of slavery. And I made some major decisions in my life on what training I would have and what I would do. Always back into my mind, I would be drafted. And so when I got drafted, it seems like, well, I knew it was coming, even though there was a period of time, in the 70s after people got sick of the Vietnam War, the people were reacting, and for a couple years, we didn't have the draft. We didn't even have the registration until 1979 and 1980. The effort was made to renew the registration, which I always thought was foolish and it made no sense whatsoever. Why would you do it unless you want to enslave these people? And it really is one of the most discriminatory events of our government. They worry about equity and fairness and civil liberties, but how can you have it without, you don't need 10 million people in the military. You need to pick and choose. And up until now, it's always been that when they've had drafts, the minority suffered the most for various reasons. They suffered the most. But right now, they're talking about again, because of the market saying to young people, what do you want to get into the military? Yeah. There's been a decrease in enthusiasm for the military. Interesting enough, there's records now that surprisingly, even the support coming from the hawkish type of Republican Party has been greatly reduced. It went down like 20 points in the last couple of years. So that is telling us something, that there's something wrong, and it isn't Vietnam going on right now. Yeah. And even the tragedy of the Mideast wars going on, and even the tragedy of us being involved in precipitating and pursuing war in Syria and in Ukraine, that's not it. There's something else going on, and of course we want to talk about that. But we came across an article that talks a lot about it. A military person who comes up with the decision. It disappeared in military.com. We need a limited military. No sweat. It's limited. They're not going to draft you, Daniel, so don't worry about it. Yep. This is bad news for the concept of liberty. I think it should be attacked on basic principle of whose life is it anyway, and make sure that people at least hear the principles. It's not your life if the government has total economic control of every penny you earn, and what you can do at certain times, and set up all the rules, and that family members and individuals and everybody is vulnerable. The whole system is vulnerable to people being, susceptible to the government coming and say, we need you to go.
And the Biden administration is without a doubt, with support of Republicans, as you would say, is pursuing a conflict with Russia and China simultaneously. There's going to be a real need. And so here's more of the rationale of this Lieutenant Colonel. And again, I say it's going to resonate with a lot of people. Do this next one because it's all practical. It's all about, actually go back one. It's all about practical. Here's what he said. Here's what his model, the hybrid model, if you can rewind just one, please. He said, okay, it's going to alleviate the incredible pressure on recruiters. It's going to lower the cost of finding new troops. And significantly, this is the one part that's interesting, Dr. Paul, significantly reduce the much decried civilian-military gap by subjecting all of America's youth, rich and poor, to the possibility of service in the draft. So he's saying, we're going to get rid of the poverty draft. We're going to have rich kids going too, as well as poor kids, and that'll make it more even. We're going to save a lot of money. And not only that, if you put the next one on, it's going to save money, it's going to ease up our recruiters, it's going to even up the gap between the rich and the poor, and it might also have the added effect of increasing public pressure to prevent open-ended wars led by unaccountable senior leaders. So you have all of this, but wait, there's more, one more, and you mentioned it earlier on, Dr. Paul. It's going to do all those wonderful things, and it's going to, the establishment of an all-volunteer force also drove the military to expend an incredible amount of resources in terms of manpower and dollars to build a recruiting machine. So it's going to save all this money of the recruiting machine, considering it costs, as you mentioned earlier, $15,000 to recruit each new member, and the overall cost each year exceeds $2 billion for recruiting. Save money, prevent wars, do all these wonderful things. I don't know, Dr. Paul, he's doing a hard sell here.
You know, along with what you were just saying here, it would increase public pressure to prevent open-ended wars led by unaccountable senior leaders. You know, they said the draft is going to prevent those kind of wars, which doesn't make any sense. Because what do they not talk about? What we talk about here about 90% of the time when we're on foreign policy, mind our own business, come home, you know, and defend this country. But no, they have all this. This is fancy, and like you say, his strategy of what, and he knows to whom he's speaking. You know, the American people. And they, this sounds pretty good. Yeah. This sounds. It's
a compromise.
You can still be patriotic. Matter of fact, he wants people to feel more patriotic because they've worked out a disagreement, you know, and coming together to defend this country. Yet it's the conflicts in the country. Why are we involved? Well, you know, in the Middle East and right now in Ukraine, it has to do not because we don't have a draft. It's because we've drafted the American people to work and slave and cough up a lot of money for us to build weapons to enrich the military-industrial complex. That's the part they don't want to touch. Not once does he mention that kind of material. Yeah. And we can throw our weight around, we can cut people off, we can put on sanctions. These, you know, I've always argued that, you know, if we had some of these boycotts placed against us, what if China would ever do that to us, you know, and had 20 ships in the Gulf of Mexico to prove that it's, you know, it's a free lane and they have a right to be there. That would be different. But we're an empire on decline, and of course, what's up for grabs is what's going to replace it. Yeah. You see, I don't think they can stop the decline of the empire. It happens throughout all history. All the empires disappear, and it's always be overextension overseas and over authoritarianism to do this, taxes or whatever, and people finally get disgusted with it. And the big question is, what will replace it? And I think that's where we have advanced, with civilization over the last several hundred years. I mean, there's so much technology that has been advanced, but it's so often used for the military and used for the power of the dictators, where the technology should be used, for promoting a free society. And that is the challenge. And that's where I hope I'm right, that there is progress being made in those areas.
Yeah.
They say that you're crazed, your hair is much too gray. These insane ideas of peace, well, they cannot be the way. They had you in the corner and they told us to stay away. You've been the only one to see clear through the hate and the fear. Promises that they made, they won't let you play. And for every one of us, you make a stand each day to fight the right to rise, to hold the epitaph at bay. For both the wrong and the wronged, and you've done it all along. We all know that you're no Superman. You've never stopped giving us the very best you can. I'll say it now, and I hope that you understand. You've shown us what it takes to make a hero from a man. Attempts to open up their eyes only brings on despise. Driven by fear and lies, war calls and battle cries. Arrogance, they brutalize you just for taking the time to remind us all that we can fall, but there's hope for us all. We all know that you're no Superman. You never stop giving us the very best you can. I'll say it now, and I hope that you understand. You've shown us what it takes to make a hero from a man.
Poland rushes troops to border with Belarus. So Poland on Tuesday said that it was rushing more troops to its border with Belarus after accusing Belarus of violating Polish airspace with military helicopters, a claim that Belarusian officials denied. So according to Reuters, Poland's defense ministry said that it was sending additional forces and resources, including combat helicopters, to the border. Belarus has accused Poland of making up the allegation about helicopters violating its airspace to justify a further military buildup on the border. The Belarusian Defense Ministry said, quote, "This statement was not backed up by data from Poland. The Belarusian Defense Ministry views it in the manner of an old wives' tale and notes there were no border violations by Mi-8 and Mi-24 helicopters," end quote. So Poland has already been beefing up its border with Belarus due to the presence of the Russian mercenary force Wagner Group in Belarus. Wagner members recently held drills near the border, and Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko claimed that the Russian mercenaries wanted to enter Poland. Amid these tensions that have been brewing between Poland and Belarus, Russian President Vladimir Putin warned Poland that he would treat an attack on Belarus as an attack on Russia. He also accused Poland of having designs on Ukrainian territory and warned that a Polish-Lithuanian force might enter Western Ukraine under the guise of kind of helping, the Ukrainians, but really with the goal of wanting to occupy the territory. That's what Putin's saying. So definitely an area to keep an eye on. Poland has been one of the most hawkish, gung-ho, NATO countries when it comes to supporting this proxy war and their rhetoric and support for Ukraine. And, this is something that could always spiral out of control, especially if helicopters are crossing the border. Who knows what the story is with that. So Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese on Tuesday insisted that his government was taking a firm stand against the U.S. persecution of WikiLeaks founder and Australian citizen Julian Assange. So during a recent visit to Australia, Secretary of State Antony Blinken rejected concerns raised by his Australian counterpart about Assange, who faces up to 175 years in prison for exposing U.S. war crimes if extradited to the U.S. Albanese told reporters on Tuesday that the U.S. case against Julian Assange has gone on for too long. He said enough is enough. He said Blinken's public comments about Assange echo what U.S. officials have said privately about the WikiLeaks founder. He said, quote, "We remain very firm in our view and our representations to the American government, and we will continue to do so," end quote. So this is good to see him saying that. But on the other hand, while he's insisting that his government is firm on the issue, the U.S. pursuit of Assange has not impacted U.S.-Australian military ties. So I've been covering the U.S. and Australia during that visit when Blinken was in Australia saying this. They also announced all these new, steps to increase the U.S. military footprint in the country. This article is from Consortium News. 3 Australian members of parliament have dismissed U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken's strong statement in support of prosecuting imprisoned WikiLeaks publisher Julian Assange as nonsense. Independent MP Andrew Wilkie told The Guardian's Australian edition that Assange was, quote, not the villain, and if the U.S. wasn't obsessed with revenge, it would drop the extradition charge as soon as possible. Antony Blinken's allegation that Julian Assange risked very serious harm to U.S. national security is patent nonsense. Mr. Blinken would be well aware of the inquiries in both the U.S. and Australia, which found that the relevant WikiLeaks disclosures did not result in harm to anyone. The only deadly behavior was by U.S. forces exposed by WikiLeaks, like the Apache crew who gunned down Iraqi civilians and Reuters journalists, end quote. And he's referring to the infamous collateral murder video. So it's good to see more opposition to the U.S. persecution of Julian Assange. This article is from Connor Freeman over at the Libertarian Institute. The Biden administration released a report endorsing the renewal of a controversial law which enables U.S. intelligence agencies to spy on foreign nationals and American citizens on Monday. This comes amid a heated debate in Congress regarding how such surveillance powers are weaponized against the American people, as well as a slew of scandals involving these capabilities being wielded by the FBI against protesters and lawmakers. So published by the President's Intelligence Advisory Board and Intelligence Oversight Board, the 42-page report states that a failure of Congress to renew Section 702 of the FISA Amendments Act before it expires at the end of the year would constitute one of the worst intelligence failures of our lifetime. So Section 702 authorizes a tool used by U.S. spy agencies to conduct warrantless surveillance on foreign targets and any Americans with whom they may be interacting. This practice has long been criticized by domestic civil liberties groups because in the process also collected are U.S. citizens' electronic communications, including phone calls, text messages, and emails. I speak with a lot of people outside of the country, so, under this law, that means that they could, use this to spy on me. So it's a very serious thing here, and it's not a surprise that the White House wants to renew it. If it's not reauthorized in December, the law will expire, which would be very good, and there has been more opposition to this from Republicans lately because the FBI has kind of been weaponized against some of them. So hopefully, that with some of the Democrats that are still opposed to it, you have a lot of Democrats, I'm sure, that favor extending this, but there are still some that are against it. So hopefully it's enough to stop this because this is a serious abuse of the government's power. This article is from Kyle Anzalone, again, at the Libertarian Institute. And this is, as far as I know, this is the first, formal meeting between U.S. and Taliban officials since the U.S. withdrew from Afghanistan back in August 2021. They've, I believe, held some kind of, some sort of talks, but this is the first official meeting. So U.S. officials met with Taliban diplomats in Qatar for 2 days of talks. The discussions come as Washington's economic war in Kabul has caused severe suffering for the Afghan people 2 years after the end of the U.S. military occupation. So yeah, the U.S. sanctions are all still in effect, and they seized the central bank funds. A State Department press release said that Special Representative for Afghanistan, Thomas West, and the Special Envoy for Afghan Women, Rina Amiri, and the Chief of the Mission to Afghanistan, Karen Decker, met with senior Taliban officials on Sunday and Monday. The press release said that U.S. officials chastised the Taliban over their human rights abuses, which is not a surprise. Since returning to power in 2021, the Taliban have imposed bans preventing women from publicly participating in society. And Kyle mentions that Washington's human rights record in Afghanistan is also abysmal. America's 2-decade occupation of Afghanistan was marked by mass killings of civilians, torture, and support for warlords who habitually sexually abused young boys. Remember how they left August 29th, 2021. Biden ordered a drone strike that slaughtered 10 civilians and 7 children, one of the last U.S. military action in Afghanistan. During the talks, American and Taliban officials also discussed the Afghan economy. The Taliban's calling for the U.S. to lift sanctions and unfreeze Afghan central bank funds. I don't know if these talks made any progress in that direction or not. It doesn't seem like it. But interesting that they held this meeting.
Here's Gerald Salenti with today's trends in the news.
What a disgusting country this has turned into. What a disgusting fucking clowns running the show. Stealing our money, giving it to their buddies. Oh, you like that merger and acquisition activity, huh? How about those hedge funds? Oh, no, I like private equity groups. Ooh, venture capitalists are for me. All these things didn't exist when I was a young man. I say this over and over again. There were hardware stores, grocery stores, drugstores. One story after another. Now there are chain stores. There are stationary chains. Oh, go to Staples. Oh, no more hardware stores. Go to Lowe's. No, I go to Home Depot. I got one or two. How about grocery stores? Kroger's for me. Fuck you, mom and pop. How about drugstores? Oh, CVS. I love them. I love them. Oh, how about Walgreens? Well, they're good too. You got it. Fucking little scumbag pricks. And I can't say the other word. Have sold this country out and give it to the bigs. Little stupid fucking morons. Little fucking stupid morons. And again, I was on the other side. I was the assistant to the secretary of the New York State Senate. I saw the freak show firsthand. Scumbags. Now let's get to your Trends Journal, because this is an important issue. As a matter of fact, there's a great article in this week's Trends Journal by Gregory Manarino. Are you ready? Central banks will vastly inflate from here. Yep, every president and every world leader knows it, he said. Currently, every single developed nation on earth is expected to vastly increase spending moving forward. And with that, global debt will continue to spiral ever higher with no end. That's right. Central banksters. Once upon a time, as the story goes, Jesus Christ, the Prince of Peace, became violent to drive the banksters out of the temple. Well, this is a 2012 issue. The numbers are coming out, and they're not good. And all they're doing is selling more fucking low-life scumbag prostitute. Bullshit. Because you know why? They swallow. Bullshit. You know why? Because they're a bunch of bullshit. Yep. That's all they are. Bullshit. Absolute bullshit. That is bullshit. That's who they are. This is serious what's going on. The numbers suck. The numbers suck. Oh, you ready? Germany's economy is stagnant. Stagnant. Yeah, 2 fucking quarters of negative GDP. Oh, it hasn't moved right now, so it's okay. Hey, how about Italy? Oh, it's down. Hey, Sweden, it's down. How about Austria? Well, it's down. But overall, there was economic growth. Hey, fuckface. Germany's the 4th largest economy in the world. It's in recession. It hasn't moved. China, hey, did you look at their purchasing managers' numbers coming in, PMI numbers? Nah, we don't look at that stuff. This is serious what's going on. And we're giving it to you. Economic update, market overview. You ready? Corporate debt is at risk. No kidding. Only said this for how long? Most junk bonds have been downgraded. They call investors steer clear of consumer stocks. We say gamblers steer clear because consumers aren't buying. This is vacation time. They're spending money on services. This thing is serious what's going on. Oh, and JP Morgan, all of a sudden it became a gold bug. Yep. And is the housing recession over? Office building bust? 2 more U.S. banks bite the dust, just the beginning. And then, of course, trends on the global economic front. When the economy falls, jobs go with it. This is our 49th week of putting all the job losses that are going on. And what else do we have? Oh, a load of stuff. What's going on in Canada? What's going on in Europe? What's going on in China? By the way, China's manufacturing activity shrunk for the 4th consecutive month. And we have a spotlight on the office building bust. And Ukraine war trend update. What's going on over there? Whole load of stuff. I want to talk a little bit about what's going on with these interest rate hikes. Things are going to go down. We're in a summer state of mind right now. The GDP numbers are going up because people are traveling more, spending more in restaurants, in hotels. They're not buying more products to bring up the GDP. And we're certainly not manufacturing them because the manufacturing numbers keep going down, as we detail in the Trends Journal, not only here, but in Europe as well and in China. Manufacturing is a key element. They don't talk about it. It's not what people buy. It's what they're making. And then as inflation, they're selling the bullshit that inflation numbers are coming down. They're not going down. People are buying less and they're paying more. Insurance on houses, on cars, healthcare, boom, skyrocketing. The numbers that have gone up on, the average price of a car, $50,000 for a piece of electronic shit. So yeah, the prices are coming down, but they're still very high. So our forecast is that you're going to start seeing the market start to tremble a little bit. But it's August. It's people are over in Europe. They're out of it. It's gone. It's vacation time. The reality is going to start hitting in mid-September to August.
Your daily dose of liberty education starts here. The Tom Woods Show.
As early as February of 2020, I started to share articles and ask questions about the effectiveness and viability of what I saw coming down the pike. They were planting the seeds as early as February that we were going to go into lockdown. And I ended up just getting into fights with family and friends. I didn't fight. I didn't kind of raise my proverbial voice, but others attacked me pretty viciously. And I moved off of Facebook. I still have an account, but I moved off of it pretty quickly because I didn't want to fight with family and friends. And I also found that on Twitter, as you know, you can meet people that you don't know. You can engage in conversations with people you don't know. I could DM doctors about specific data and they would answer my questions. So I was very curious and trying to educate myself. So I moved over to Twitter fairly quickly. And it's interesting, when I went back and I was writing the book, I looked back at some of the Facebook conversations I had remembered, and many of the people who had attacked me had deleted those posts.
Oh, is that so? Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to print some of them in the book or use some of the arguments that folks made. And I remembered one conversation in particular. It was driving me crazy because I couldn't find it, but I found my part of the conversation. But on Facebook, I don't think you can see that it's deleted. You know, on Twitter, you can see when something's deleted. And I was so confused. And then I realized that person had gone in and deleted everything because in hindsight, it was ridiculous. It made no sense. I was correct. Schools were harmful. I wasn't a teacher murderer. And so I can only imagine they felt some shame in how they had spoken to me in that interaction.
You eventually went on with Laura Ingraham on Fox News, and you report on this in the book.
That was a kiss of death. Yeah.
Yeah, that was because for some reason, we've moved into this phase of American history in which if you go on somebody's show, you are therefore on that person's team and endorse everything that person thinks.
That's right. If you talk to somebody.
And by the way, I deal with that as a podcast host because if I have person X on the show, that means I endorse everything person X thinks.
Yeah, it's ridiculous.
What kind of a boring show would that be?
Yeah, it's ridiculous. I mean, you should have friends you don't agree with on everything. My husband and I don't agree on everything. I mean, it's just ludicrous. But yeah, what happened was it was a year in because I had been kind of dissenting and expressing my views on social media, but also I led rallies to get the schools open. I wrote op-eds. I attended school board meetings. I wasn't just banging away at the keyboard. I was really trying to move this thing forward and get the schools open unsuccessfully. No media outlets would cover open schools moms, as we called ourselves. No one would give us a platform or a voice in the conversation. It was all just more of the same. It was the teachers' unions and Randy Weingarten and the politicians in the left-leaning states saying, if you open the schools, you'll kill all the teachers, which we know is false. We knew it then, and we certainly know it now. And so in March of 2021, I had moved my family to Denver, Colorado, so that my young children could attend school. I had a kindergartner at the time, and his only experience thus far had been in Zoom school, and that was not the experience of school I wanted him to have. When I shared that on Twitter, the Ingram angle reached out to me to appear on the show, and I consulted with my fellow open schools moms, and I said, I know this is going to be controversial, but what do you think? Should I do it? And we had been agitating to try to get ourselves in the mainstream media to no avail, and they all said, you should do it. Stick to your talking points. Don't say anything you don't mean. I'm a trained media professional. You know, as the brand president, I knew I could do it. So I agreed to be on the show. And of course, that unleashed everything you just alluded to inside the company and outside the company. And suddenly that was just reinforcement that I was a white supremacist in disguise. I didn't care if Black children died. That's what was said, because if you wanted the schools to open, public schools, which are disproportionately populated by low-income and Black and brown students, that I clearly didn't care if those children died. And it really, I mean, I lasted at the company for almost a full other year, but that just started this kind of employee outrage inside the company because I had basically, in their minds, revealed my true colors as a very right-leaning racist. I mean, that's what they assumed. And when I say the noise got loud inside the company, it was still a small, very punitive group of employees, but they created a lot of disruption, and they emailed HR and they emailed my boss, the CEO, and they got sick of it. The leaders in the company got sick of it, and they were very afraid of what that might do to the reputation of the company. And there was that same sort of pushback on social media. And COVID really became this woke policy of the progressive left. We need to stay shut down forever. We're doing it to protect the vulnerable when in fact it harmed the vulnerable the most. It became, I don't know why, I'm not sure I'll ever understand it. It could be because there was a presidential election coming and they wanted to demonize Trump and his policies, although he helped support the lockdown. So that's neither here nor there. But it just became highly politicized, I would argue, because the left politicized it. And so it's all part and parcel with all of these quote unquote progressive or left-leaning policies and programs that companies are furthering in the world today. It became kind of all one and the same. And clearly COVID and the Black Lives Matter protests in the summer of 2020 sort of merged, right? For some people, that was their awakening. They were going, wait a minute, why is public health saying thousands can gather for these rallies, but not other reasons? It doesn't make any sense.
Does everyone, do you guys know that there was someone who died on the Obama estate recently? Okay, yes. So a person died. This is what's, yes. So first, they reported that it was just some random person that had nothing to do with the Obamas or anything like that. Then it came out that it was Obama's private chef, but who had like he
been vaccinated.
That was great. Yeah, this guy's good. There's a reason why I bring him with me everywhere I go. Well, then it came out that he had been, I don't know if he was fired or quit, but he was his former private chef or something like that. And then at first they were like, oh, Obama, Barack and Michelle were out of town. They weren't there. Then it came out that they were there. So it's all these different conflicting stories. But evidently there's a picture of Barack Obama. This might be completely altered. I'm getting this from Rob. I don't know if he's verified this at all. But evidently Barack Obama has been spotted with a Kentucky Fried Chicken hand. Is this real, Rob?
And so this was just a random Twitter spotting, and I was like, that can't be real. But then I found the exact picture from, it's always good.
Another random Twitter spotting?
No. It was from the UK, what's that? Daily Mail, thank you. It was from the Daily Mail.
So you know it's real.
I mean, it's not the Wall Street Journal, but it's also not a random Twitter page, so.
Okay, so this is in the Daily Mail. All right, that's something. Yeah. And so what they're saying, so he's got some tape on some fingers. It doesn't look great.
No. Also, can I tell you, this is why I don't believe this picture, is because Barack Obama wasn't beating someone up. If he was going to kill someone, he would drone them. That's what he does. You know what I mean? Everyone's got their move. He would call in a, that's
his signature.
That's his Mortal Kombat fatality. Right. That's the way that would happen.
Well, isn't it? I mean, look, dude, that's a great joke, but isn't it? You're really touching on something that I think is fucking. So I talked about this when I was on Patrick Bet-David's show the other day, because he had just gotten in a thing. Yeah, he's great. I love that guy. So he had just gotten. Yeah, he's a monster. But so he had gotten in a thing with Anthony Weiner earlier that day, and then I went on the show later that day, and he had brought up the all of the people who are adjacent to the Clintons who have ended up murdered.
Oh, what a great clip that was.
And Anthony Weiner is just morally outraged about this. You know,
you're better than this.
He was like, how dare you, says the guy who sends dick pics to 15-year-olds. Anyway, which is really something to say. Once you're outed for sending dick pics to 15-year-olds, you really can't be morally outraged about anyone else, you know? But he was talking about this, and I mentioned this when I was on the show because the topic came up, and I was like, well, why is it that we're supposed to think it's so crazy that these guys would have someone killed when we know that they've had hundreds of thousands of people killed? It's just called foreign policy, but you know what I mean? Okay, I understand some of you can separate the idea that the government launching a war is completely different than you just killing someone or you just hiring someone to have someone killed. But if it was any other organization other than the government, if you just had a job where part of the job was hiring someone to kill people, and then you were accused in your private life of hiring someone to kill people, and I went, they would never do that. Wouldn't you kind of be like, well, yeah, no, they totally would. Because they do that at work every day. You know what I mean? And so there's just something interesting about that where people be like, oh, the Clintons had these people killed, and people go, there's no way. And you're like, well, I know they've had people killed. We all know they've had people killed. Obama is literally, he was quoted as saying, and I quote, I'm very good at murdering people. That's, you can go Google Obama, I'm very good at murdering people. And there's an intern who will tell you this is what he said to him. And he was talking about the drone bomb campaigns. He was like, yo, if you're a terrorist, I'll fucking murder you, you know? And also, if you're within 100 miles of a terrorist, I'll probably murder you too. Right. He didn't say that verbatim, but that's really what the track record demonstrates.
Or just at a wedding with some kids.
It's or maybe we just misread some cell phone data, you know, and we kill it. But anyway, it's just
don't borrow your friend's phone in Pakistan.
Just why is it so crazy to assume that the guy who killed people professionally would maybe have someone killed privately. It's like if you heard a story about me being at home with my wife and they were like, did you hear what happened when Dave was with his wife? He was cracking jokes. And you went, he would never. He would never do that.
Oh, all right here. Last question. Make it good or I'll fucking murder you.
Dave, what does Ron Paul mean to you?
That to me, he's the fucking, the OG of all this shit. I mean, Ron Paul, like, he, like, I don't know. It's a weird thing to say. It almost sounds like so strange for me to say it, but like Ron Paul is like a father figure to me in a lot of ways, and I never had like I didn't have like a father in my life. And I've only met Ron Paul like 6 times or something like that. But something like that. I don't know. I said something like that. That was a weird response. That's it, motherfucker? Like, all right, fine. But to me, what he is like, I can't say enough nice things about the guy. I think Ron Paul is the greatest living American hero. Like the absolute greatest. Like, and I don't think that's an overstatement. Like this motherfucker is, first off, as someone who has 2 kids, he's a baby doctor. He was an OBGYN who delivered like 3,000 babies. So just that alone, I think would make you like a great man. And then on top of that, he's a country baby doctor who then just decided, because he was like obsessively reading about Austrian economics and war and history. Like what doctor is doing that? And then goes, I understand this stuff so much that I have to run for Congress simply to make a point, to like let people know this is the path our country's going on. And he did this in the 70s because we had gotten off the gold standard right after we fought the war in Vietnam. And he was like, I have to let people know that there's like a path that we're going down here as a country that's going to lead toward like an authoritarian society. So he gives up his medical practice to go run for Congress and then wins, and then goes, I have to stay in Congress to keep fighting all of these authoritarian measures. And then after that, after doing that for another 30 years, like, first off, he ran for president in 88, then goes back to Congress in the 90s, then goes, like, in 2008, 30 years later, I got to run for president to let everybody know. And then so many people love what he has to say that 4 years later, at this point, he's in his late 70s. He's like, I'm going to run for president again to keep spreading this message because you know what? There's so much important shit in this tradition of John Locke and, whatever, Murray Rothbard and Ludwig von Mises and all of these guys, and that I'm going to keep introducing people to these ideas because they're so important for people to know them. And then he, since then, and then he's like, after he's done, now he's almost 90, and he's still like, I'm going to do a show every day, just trying to inform people about what's really going on here. And the whole time he's done that, he's been married to the same woman his whole life. I think they've been married for 60 years or something like that. He's got like 5 kids and like 25 grandkids or something like that. Like, I don't know, dude. He's fucking Thomas Jefferson of our generation. He's just like the greatest living American hero, and better than Thomas Jefferson. And like, and I'll tell you this, like, and this is the thing, I literally was saying this to Rob earlier today, by the way, for how much I've ever talked about Ron Paul, that even today we were saying this, is that as much as I hate, progressives and like the progressive politicians piss me the fuck off, it's the thing that still keeps me a member of the Libertarian Party that I'll just never forgive Republicans for. And maybe this is because this was just my time, is that, say whatever, there was something today, and this is where it came from, was that Rob was telling me about today, I guess Rand Paul and Mitt Romney had some back and forth in the Senate where Mitt Romney was like arguing for why the government should be allowed to like talk to social media companies to tell them who they think's spreading misinformation. And Rand Paul was like, no, they shouldn't, because that's fucking not the role of government. And I'm just like, no matter what, even as much as the progressives piss me off, and sometimes I feel like I have more in common with Republican voters than Democratic voters, I'm just like, you motherfuckers picked Mitt Romney over Ron Paul. And I'll never forgive you for that. You had Thomas Jefferson running for president, and you picked Mitt fucking Romney over him. It's almost like you deserve everything you're getting, you know? I know that was 10 years ago, but like, you deserve it. You deserve your kids to be transed for what you did to Ron Paul, that you'd pick Mitt Romney over him, you know? So, greatest living American, Ron Paul. That's a great way to end the fucking show. Thank you guys so much. I love you so much for coming out.
Now, you have a great piece in the recent American Conservative called Make Peace, You Fools, with an exclamation point. And it goes down the list of what's happening in the very shifting landscape when it comes to the U.S.-NATO war against Russia through Ukraine. And one of the points you make toward the end is the reason why you say make peace, you fools, which is your recognition that the neocons have no reverse gear. They only know how to escalate, and things aren't going according to plan. Now, you bring up the topic of a Polish-led division, including the Balts and some mercenaries, going into some areas of Western Ukraine. Do you think that might be the next chapter in escalation? And if so, how do you see that playing out?
Well, I think, unfortunately, it's plausible. One of the things that we need to keep in mind is that this is another unnecessary war. This could have been avoided very early if we had simply listened to the Russians and treated their security interests seriously. There was no need to advance beyond the eastern border of Poland. Some people would argue there was no reason to advance NATO beyond the borders of Germany. But at this point, having gone into Ukraine and then worked tirelessly to turn it into a platform for attack against Russia, we have essentially consigned Ukraine to destruction. And that's where we are now. Ukraine is actually in ruins. And this brings us to a point in this crisis or conflict that I think is more dangerous than ever.
You know, the propaganda machine is obviously very important. And leading up to this, it was, the anti-Russia propaganda, and that's continuing. It's there. Russia did it. NATO's totally innocent. They're saving humanity and democracy and protecting our national defense and that sort of thing. But, already in the last month or so, it seems like there's been a shift. Not that everything you said is absolutely true and it's going to continue until it really collapses, but I think the propagandists have shifted. At least the noise I hear is it's China, it's China, it's China. And this to me means, maybe they have to shift. They blame Russia for everything. Who knows? They're not going to blame NATO. And maybe they can get away with saying, well, it was all Ukraine's fault for getting us involved in that over there. But they're right now, this China bashing, how do you see that in context of what's going on in Ukraine? It just seems like they're preparing, well, we have to have another enemy. And when you talk to the politicians and listen to them, the right and the left, the Republicans are probably worse than the Democrats, but they're all terrible. But they're pretty much together. We got to go for China because they are the real enemy. They've sort of diminished, the attack on Russia for the moment.
Well, I think there's much truth in that. Let's face it, they failed miserably to, quote unquote, weaken Russia. If anything, Russia is stronger now, more capable militarily than it has been since the 1980s. So the whole operation in Ukraine from a purely American standpoint is a total failure. And no doubt there is a desire to distract attention from this inevitable failure that's going to creep into the news and eventually find its way into American consciousness. So there are two things going on. I think, as we pointed out, you have this lingering potential for a terrible, terrible regional war in Ukraine that persists. And at the same time, it's obvious that people are looking privately for a way to sort of disengage by saying, well, look, we did everything we could. We gave these Ukrainians everything. They just couldn't make it happen. So it's their problem now. Meanwhile, let's look at China, the new boogeyman.
And empires, and because of bad policy, and very often debt. They can't afford it anymore. And we're facing that. I think our preparedness for a true defensive war is diminished. At the same time, the debt is skyrocketing. So every year, the military budget comes up. They just passed it in the House and the Senate. They haven't had it signed yet. But my effort to try to diminish that was a proposal I want you to comment on. That is that maybe we could agree on cutting the military because we don't need it if we had a slightly different foreign policy. Now, in a practical sense, you wondered if you think that's a possibility, or do you think the politicians would ever do that to actually cut back? But, you know, the Republicans and the Democrats are really gung-ho. That is like a sacred bill, you know, in the Congress, although we see signs that the number in opposition is growing right now, and hopefully that will put them in a position where they think, well, maybe we will have to cut. But the budget eventually, I think, will be a limiting factor for the war.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. Unfortunately, history suggests that politicians would rather go under than admit that anything is wrong or should be adjusted. I mean, the problem with defense spending is it's just too profitable for too many people inside the Beltway. And I don't know how you change that. And of course, whenever you look at the defense budget, how much of it is simply redistributed income? Income that goes to donors, income that goes to selected constituents in specific districts and states. I mean, you know that from your vast experience coming from Texas. But I think there's another factor here. Every time I bring up the debt, I'm told, well, Doug, you just don't understand modern economics. Debt doesn't matter. Well, I think we're about to get an education, one that you tried to impart to people back many, many years ago. It's going to happen. But look at the British Empire. When did the British ultimately leave India, the great crown jewel in the crown of the British Empire? It left when the debt to GDP ratio was 240%. That was after World War II in 1947, when the British had effectively bankrupted themselves during the war. That's when I think we will finally give up the ghost and walk away. The bad news is that when that happens, the military establishment is almost dissolved or liquidated in a fire sale. Now, some people will say, well, that's just fine. My argument has always been that's not a good thing, because you do need a military establishment, but you don't need what you have. And you need to do this prudently and intelligently. But I fear that won't happen. I mean, just trying to explain to people that, you know, you don't want large numbers of U.S. forces at sea or on land overseas in forward bases anymore, because the world has changed. Precision-guided munitions that can be launched over thousands of miles make that sort of thing self-defeating. It means that if you do have forces anywhere and somebody shoots at you at the people where you happen to have troops stationed, you're going to be dragged into something that you may want nothing to do with. So this whole business of forward basing needs to go away. Nobody wants to admit that you can't rapidly reinforce across the Pacific and the Atlantic Oceans. There are these things now called submarines. They are the king of warfare at sea. In the Navy, people talk about two kinds of ships in the Navy. One class, submarines, the other class, targets. I mean, things have changed in terms of technology. We don't want to come to terms with that, because if you start recognizing what you cannot do in the future that you did in the past, well, then people say exactly what you did, Dr. Paul. Well, perhaps we don't need X, Y, and Z anymore. And they're right. We don't. In September, I want to talk about a few things, one of which is the four horsemen of the apocalypse. And I identify those as being atheism, nihilism, Marxism, and globalism. And those four horses are running all over the West and trampling our civilization beneath their feet. And that's what has to end. And the only people that can do that are us. I mean, if there's one thing I keep trying to tell people over and over and over, well, do you think so-and-so is going to be elected and he will save us? He will lead us out of this. And I keep looking at them and saying, stop looking for someone to save you. Organize. Become active. You've got to save yourselves.
In the year 2008, the economy was great, and only one man could see the coming fall. They ridiculed his age and laughed his views across the stage. That one man was the Congressman Ron Paul. Well, they say that he's too old, just like Michelangelo, Eisenhower, and Charles de Gaulle. But he'll stop those endless wars and show those lobbyists the doors, which is why your vote should surely be Ron Paul. Ooh, why your vote should surely be Ron Paul. Palin cannot win, we know that Huck is growing thin, and Mitt Romney is the bushiest of all. Obama sold us out, he gave those bankers all the clout, which is why your vote should surely be Ron Paul. I'm a Ron Paul girl, a Ron Paul girl. You can bet my vote will surely be Ron Paul. In the year 2010, a lot of voters turned to him. His Tea Party candidates, they came to town. So the question still remains, will those people want to change? Will they have the brains to kick Obama out? Well, they say he's too old, just like Michelangelo, Adenauer, and Charles de Gaulle. But he'll stop those endless wars and show those lobbyists the doors, which is why your vote should surely be Ron Paul.
President Biden wants Taiwan aid in the next Ukraine funding bill. So Financial Times reported on Wednesday that the White House is expected to ask Congress to include military aid for Taiwan in the next spending bill to fund the war in Ukraine. They want to lump it together. Citing people familiar with the matter, the report said that the White House's Office of Management and Budget is expected to submit a request to Congress for another emergency supplemental funding bill sometime this month. And this is a type of spending that is not capped by the debt ceiling deal that was reached between the White House and House Republicans. So the White House will ask to include funds for Taiwan through the Foreign Military Financing, which is a State Department program that gives foreign governments money to purchase U.S. weapons. So there's $2 billion in this FMF for Taiwan included in the 2023 National Defense Authorization Act, but those funds were not granted by congressional appropriators. So the White House is looking to get some. And this news comes after the White House announced that it was sending Taiwan a $345 million military aid package using the Presidential Drawdown Authority, which allows the U.S. to send weapons directly from Pentagon stockpiles, the primary way they've been arming Taiwan. The 2023 NDAA also included $1 billion in this authority for Taiwan, and this marked the first time that the Biden administration drew from those funds. So both of these types of assistance are unprecedented in the era of normalized relations between the U.S. and China, as I've covered quite a bit. Since 1979, the U.S. has always sold weapons to Taiwan but never financed the purchases or provided them free of charge. So from Beijing's perspective, this new form of U.S. support is extremely provocative, and we've seen several statements from Chinese government officials condemning the move. All right, the next one here, no Ukrainian breakthroughs in counteroffensive. So Ukrainian forces have still made no breakthroughs against Russian forces in the counteroffensive despite sending thousands of more troops to the front for a renewed push in the southeast. This is according to a report from Politico. They cited Pentagon officials. So U.S. officials said last week that the main thrust of the Ukrainian counteroffensive had begun and that Ukraine committed NATO-trained forces it was holding in reserve. The push was focused on Zaporozhye, and the idea was to sever the land bridge Russia has secured to Crimea, and there have been attacks in other areas along the front, more in the east as well. The Politico report said that Ukraine committed 150,000 troops to the assault along 3 axes of attack, but Pentagon officials said that the operations have not yielded significant results, with one saying that Ukrainian gains are being measured by the hundreds of meters. One official said, quote, "They are making mostly small incremental gains. They are still facing stiff Russian resistance, second and third layers of defenses," end quote. The report said that Ukraine is still keeping some of its forces in reserve. So 20 to 50,000 Ukrainians have lost limbs since Russia invaded. And this is a report based on a report from the Wall Street Journal. And this is a huge number. Between 20,000 and 50,000 Ukrainians have lost one or more limbs since Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022. This figure is based on estimates made by prosthetics firms, doctors, and charities. The number could be higher as it takes time to register amputees after they undergo surgery, and fighting has intensified since Ukraine launched its counteroffensive in June. So the higher end estimate of 50,000 came from the German prosthetics manufacturer Ottobock, which cited data from the government and medical partners. The estimate of 20,000 was based on data from the Kiev-based charity Health of the Ukrainian People, and the charity estimates the number of serious injuries in the war is at 200,000 and says about 10% of serious injuries typically require amputations. The number of Ukrainian amputations puts the war on the scale of World War I. Some 67,000 Germans and 41,000 Britons had to have amputations during the 4-year war. And when it comes to recent American wars, less than 2,000 Americans who fought in Iraq and Afghanistan in this century have had amputations. Ukraine has kept its casualty rates a secret throughout the war for propaganda purposes, but the staggering number of Ukrainians who lost limbs gives an idea of the human cost of the war. This article is from Responsible Statecraft by Connor Eccles. So in an unprecedented move, more than 100 leading medical journals from around the world called for the abolition of all nuclear weapons in an op-ed published on Tuesday. So these journals said, quote, "The prevention of any use of nuclear weapons is an urgent public health priority, and fundamental steps must also be taken to address the root cause of the problem by abolishing nuclear weapons," end quote. They said that current non-proliferation efforts are inadequate to protect the world's population against the threat of nuclear war. I think that's certainly true. There is barely any arms control treaties left, just the New START. They added, quote, "As editors of health and medical journals worldwide, we call on health professionals to alert the public and our leaders to this major danger to public health and the essential life support systems of the planet and urge action to prevent it," end quote. So the co-authors included the editors-in-chief of The Lancet and the New England Journal of Medicine, so two major medical journals there. And this article is set to release on the 78th anniversary of the American nuclear attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Hiroshima Day is August 6th, which is this Sunday. Those strikes killed as many as 200,000 Japanese civilians. And there's more attention on that with the Oppenheimer movie. Again, I haven't seen it, so I can't really comment on it too much. I got to go see it. It's just 3 hours is a pretty big chunk of my day.
Here's Gerald Salenti with today's trends in the news.
We have another article, and it'll be out tomorrow. And the title of it, Government and the Freedom of Speech. Quote, "Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech, the First Amendment of the Constitution." And you're right, the First Amendment is a negative right. It does not grant the freedom of speech. Rather, it restrains Congress from abridging right that pre-existed Congress. So, when you talk about freedom of speech, you have no freedom. All you have to do is believe the crap that the government shoves down your throat and swallow it. And if you don't believe what the government believes, and you could think for yourself and have the own facts to think for yourself, that's misinformation.
A perfect example of that is the interplay between the First Amendment, RFK Jr., Facebook, and the vaccines. Okay, so RFK Jr., like you and me, like a lot of other people who live to move the dial of public opinion, in your case and in my case, it's towards human freedom, and the same with Bobby, challenge the government on the vaccines, and we're prepared to argue, and we're arguing that these are not vaccines. A vaccine gives you a small dose of the disease. You develop the antibodies, you don't get the major disease. These are just palliatives to make you feel good. And there's a scientific argument for that. Put that on Facebook. The government goes to Facebook and says, take that down. Take it down. Take it down right now. Take it down. People are going to get sick. People are going to get harmed. Get rid of that speech. And Facebook goes along with that to get the government off their backs. Question, does that violate the First Amendment? It absolutely does, because the government can't do indirectly by intimidating Facebook what it's prohibited from doing directly, infringing upon or denying speech because of its content. Now, when Facebook does take it down, when Facebook does get in bed with the government, I'm not picking on Facebook. I'm telling you about a real case making its way through the federal court system in Texas. It happens as well with the other big tech, but the Facebook one, because it's in Texas and it's getting a lot of publicity. When Facebook does this, it will lose its ability to censor its own content, and the court will impose the First Amendment restrictions that apply to the government to Facebook if the court finds that Facebook is doing the government's bidding. So you get in bed with the government, and you wake up with the same restrictions imposed by the Constitution on the government. If you get caught, if you have a few $1 million to file the lawsuit, if you can persuade a judge and a jury that this happened to you. It happens all the time, and we don't even know about it. We know about it because Bobby Kennedy is a public person, because they kicked him off of Facebook, because some of the doctors who wanted their arguments to be on Facebook got kicked off. And in the course of that litigation, there are all kinds of emails from Facebook executives to each other saying, the White House is on our back. The government is after us. Get the government off my back. We got to do something about this.
Again, this is communism. It's Nazism. It's how dare they say what we should think? I mean, I'm not a moron. I write a magazine. I only put facts in it. And as you mentioned, this mRNA inoculation. It's the first gene therapy inoculation ever injected into a human body. And you can't question an Operation Warp Speed inoculation and say, listen, we need more data on this. No, how dare you? And again, it's not only censorship from the government. Look at all the media. They only had people on there promoting the COVID war. And I call it the COVID war, by the way, because that's what all the politicians, Trump, Boris Johnson, one after another in both parties, they called it, we're at war. And they use war because to sell fear. And when they sell the fear of war, the people march off to it. And all you need is to look at the facts. 88% of the people swallow the crap spewing out of the mouth of that little nobody, George W. Bush. We're going to get that guy Osama bin Laden dead or alive, and we go into Afghanistan, the longest war in American history that cost us, what, about $5 trillion or something, if the numbers keep going on. So the people are dumb enough to believe this. They're dumb enough to believe anybody.
The whole purpose of the First Amendment is to keep the government out of the business of speech. Speech is a natural right that belongs to individual persons. The government does not have freedom of speech. The government has nothing to do with the marketplace of ideas. So the government sneakily goes behind the scenes to pressure those who own the bulletin boards, Facebook, Google, etc., to take down statements on the bulletin boards that the government hates or fears or that challenge the government. That's absolutely prohibited by the Supreme Court. When a federal judge in Texas examined this evidence, he signed a nationwide injunction against the government, prohibiting it from communicating with any big tech about the content of speech. Of course, they can communicate with big tech about other regulatory issues, but not about the content of speech. An appellate court lifted that injunction, but I believe that the appellate court is about to reimpose it once it finishes looking at all the evidence in the case. Why does this happen? Because there is no outrage.
Yep.
There's outrage by Bobby Kennedy. There's outrage by Gerald Celente. There's outrage by Andrew Napolitano. There's outrage by libertarians. There's outrage by some progressives, but the vast majority of Americans are ho-hum. The government suppressed somebody's freedom of speech. I don't care. Ho-hum. The FBI spied illegally on 278,000 Americans. We did that one last week. It wasn't me. What do I care? There's no outrage because there's no love of liberty anymore because we are so immune to the government trampling our liberties. We expect it to happen.
You talk about what James Madison said in crafting the First Amendment. He insisted that the word "the" precede freedom of speech in order to manifest the framers' belief that the freedom of speech pre-existed the government. The First Amendment is a negative right. It doesn't grant the freedom of speech. Rather, it restrains Congress from abridging a right that pre-existed.
Because the right comes from our humanity. The government thinks it can create rights. It can't. Rights come from our humanity, from our existence, to be alive, to think as you wish, to say what you think, to publish what you say, to defend yourself, to travel, to own property. These are natural human rights that exist in the absence of the government. Or the government grants privileges. It lets us vote to make us think we're influencing it. It gives us the privilege to drive on a government roadway if you pass the government tests. I get that. But rights come from our humanity. They don't require a precondition. They don't need a government permission slip. They don't need the consensus of the community. Speech is in that right. And when government interferes with a right, when government interferes with speech, it's doing the opposite of what we've hired it to do. We've hired it to protect our rights, and instead it's assaulting them.
Your daily dose of liberty education starts here. The Tom Woods Show.
Friday, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration issued its latest proposed ruling, which will demand that by the model year 2030, I think, or 32, all new vehicles must average, wait for it, 58 miles per gallon.
Oh my gosh.
Effectively, this will outlaw pretty much every vehicle on the road that isn't at least a small hybrid. To put it in some kind of perspective, the new Prius, which was just redesigned for 2023, averages 57. And this is a compact-sized car. And if you think that a truck is going to average 58 miles per gallon, I've got some real estate on Uranus to sell you. It's not going to happen. Now, the purpose of this is to push vehicles that aren't electric off the road. And it's a really oily and subtle thing that the government does. They don't come right out and say, okay, we're going to outlaw a certain class of vehicles. What they do is promulgate regulations that have the same effect. And that way they can dodge responsibility for it. And they can even claim in a totally upended, bizarro kind of way that this is what the market is doing. This is what the market wants.
Yeah, this is that transition again. We're transitioning from one thing to another. How about that? So you're right about the way they go about it. They don't have an outright ban. They just make it impossible for you to function under the regulatory conditions they establish. So in some ways, it's like the point that I make a lot of times, which is very rarely does a bad actor in government come out and say, the reason I'm doing the things I'm doing is because I'm an evil bastard who loves to lord it over you.
Yeah.
You know, they don't say that. There's always some high-sounding reason that they do everything. But of course, that's the way it's always going to be. They're never going to say, we're doing this because we're flat out evil. Why would they say that?
Right.
So it always has to have some kind of cherry on top kind of explanation. But I think at this point, when you look at every single thing these people advocate, and it all adds up to making everybody's life much, much more challenging, I'm not buying that this is just, that's just a coincidence or their intentions are all good. I don't understand these people. I mean, maybe there are some people who just genuinely love to torture other people. I don't know what it is, but that's the best explanation I can come up with.
I think so. I really believe this. I think that there is an aspect of psychopathology here, sadism. And there's a faulty premise. Let's get back to what you just said a moment ago. This idea that we need the government to intercede as opposed to letting the market work. If there were a demand for whatever it is, X, then there's a profit motive in providing X. Let's say that it's highly fuel efficient vehicles. The Prius is a good example. That is a market-driven vehicle. The government did not have to mandate the Prius. It was brought forth at a time when gas was expensive, and Toyota came up with this brilliant solution, a vehicle that has a part-time engine and a part-time battery, and the combination of that is very efficient and very affordable and very practical. So people buy that. You know, you don't have to get a kickback from the government in order to sell that and get people to buy that. You don't have to mandate it. Good ideas don't require bayonets. I can't remember who said that, but that stuck with me for a long time. And the same with regard to this whole gas mileage thing. You know, the government will present and posture itself as the savior against these gigantic corporations, the evil oil companies, as if people were forced to buy big trucks and SUVs. That's what they want. You know, and it's not that some people don't want smaller cars that are more efficient. Those are available, and those were available long before the government got into the business of mandating mandatory mile per gallon requirements.
Now, again, this is all speculation, but I think it's quite possible that some of the elites genuinely can't stand the rest of us, can't stand the riffraff. And so if a policy they advocate means there will be fewer cars on the road, and we say, oh, the unintended consequence of this policy is that it'll be harder for poor people to get cars. That's not an unintended consequence of the policy. That gets a lot of the riffraff off the road so they can drive more comfortably to their ski vacation or whatever. This is going to make it harder for people to afford to fly on airplanes. Yeah, great. Fewer of these people to struggle with when they go to board. At this point, I can't think of any other reason. I don't believe that they actually think the world is going to end. I don't think they believe the catastrophic predictions they're making. So I'm left only with this. But anyway, that's just my private obsession. So what are we talking about with fires? What do you mean?
Lithium-ion batteries can short circuit, and everybody knows about small devices and how they sometimes catch fire. And that's why we had an issue with cell phones and airplanes. In fact, I think there were a couple of airliners that actually were brought down because there were cell phones in the cargo hold and they caught fire, brought the airplane down. These are very fast, very hot burning fires. The problem with electric cars is now you've got an enormous battery. I point out, people have no idea, many people, that the typical electric car battery weighs about 1,000 pounds, and some of them weigh close to 2,000 pounds, as in the case of the F-150 Lightning. And within that battery, there are literally thousands of individual cells, and each one of those is a potential failure point. They can short circuit and thermally run away. That's the terminology for a variety of reasons, but it's inherent in the chemistry and also potentially as a result of physical damage to the case that the battery's in. There have been a number of incidents of these EVs catching fire when they're parked. Nothing hit them. They're not even being charged to just park. They spontaneously catch fire. That's what's happened now twice with cargo ships right now out off the Dutch coast. It's the Fremantle Highway at this moment as we talk is still burning because some electric vehicles that were being transported spontaneously caught fire. And these fires, unlike gasoline fires, are very difficult to put out once they start. And even when you do put them out, they can restart. And it's interesting to me that the same governmental apparatus that says it's so very concerned about our safety, and if it saves even one life, is, again, to use our word of the day, blasé, not particularly interested in this built-in fire risk that is just an inherent problem with all electric vehicles. You know, now that I think about it, what is probably driving this to a great extent is, remember when we had the big bailouts after the last crash back around 2008? And the government came in and rescued General Motors and rescued Ford and pumped a lot of money into those businesses. And of course, there's always strings attached with that. And that's really, you can see the turning point. After that point, these corporations became kind of adjuncts of the government. And not only do they do what the government wants, they're kind of eager. And it's insane. You've got Jim Farley, who's the CEO of Ford Motor Company, publicly saying that they anticipate losing, I think it's $3.7 billion on EVs. But hell, let's double down. Let's keep on going. And eventually we might make money, maybe sometime around 2027. It's surreal.
And yet here we are. Now, on the other hand, I remember in the worst days of COVID with the proposed vax mandates, well, implemented in many cases, but also the proposed vax passport systems, some of which went into effect briefly, but we had no way of knowing whether those were going to be permanent or not. There was no way of knowing where they were going with any of this. And the good news about that, and I know a lot of our folks are very black-pilled and it's hard for them to hear good news, but we have to. As human beings, we got to hear some good news. And when it's there, we have to appreciate it instead of trying to undermine it 12 different ways and explain to me why it's actually not good news. It is good news that those systems failed. They really did fail. They had to be reversed in one city after another, whether it was Boston, New York, Chicago, all down the line, New Orleans. They had to get rid of them. And there are a number of reasons they had to get rid of them. They did not succeed. And yet that was something, they were more obsessed with COVID and those shots than they ever have been about electric cars, way more. And we just said, well, we're just not doing it. And it just didn't work. They couldn't, even without just that minority of us who wouldn't go along, they could not make it work. And so that made me think, well, it is possible in some cases, even when there's a really, really deeply held elite obsession, it's possible to resist it. But here, it's not obvious what avenues the resistance could take.
Our First Amendment is not doing well.
No, it's under attack.
It's under attack. It's sick. And you've heard my argument before. All the amendments are good. The Constitution thrust is good. Second Amendment is especially good. But I've argued that the most important thing we hang on to is the right to speak out and express ourselves and try to change people's minds voluntarily. So this is very, very important. But today we hear a lot of people getting up and saying good things about the First Amendment, but they also think there has to be a supervisor because they believe in the truth, but they will decide what is true.
Yeah.
And this is it would be compatible with the Constitution that you have a right to do that. But they sort of come along and they draw a line, but don't express your opinion. You can't have an opinion on anything, and so now it's really deteriorated ever since the hate movement has occurred in 2016, and I do that seriously because I think hate has driven so much of what's been going on, and this whole thing driven at Trump. Not that he's an easy person to defend, but he didn't follow the status quo, didn't follow the rules, and he really defied the people who want to establish what truth really is. So he obeys and knows how to use the First Amendment. All of that has turned into a hate episode, and which is continuous. They can't stand it that he actually won, and was president. So their whole goal, their whole thing driven, has been the destruction of the First Amendment, lying through their teeth, and making sure that he's not even. I mean, if they had the way, if his enemies had their way, they would not. They've tried to make sure that he wasn't even allowed to run for the presidency. So it's a mess. We're a far cry from what the First Amendment is supposed to mean, and now we have all these court cases going on. And when I look at them, they're so bad. Just like the lockdown was bad, and this polygenderism is so bad that we're breaking through on that, and people are waking up. So I don't know whether the people are going to wake up soon enough, but I know there's a lot of people who are sick and tired of the attacks by the Department of Justice and also by the FBI. I never thought that people would be that willing to criticize and try to rein in the FBI. But that's what's going to be necessary.
But this Jack Smith is so obviously a crazed partisan. When you watch him making the announcement about the indictment, and we have a clip of it, you can see that he's a crazed partisan. He's the equivalent of someone coming out with 5 masks on during COVID and a shield and a ventilator. This is how crazed the guy looks. It's literally insane. And we're going to kind of base what we're saying today on 2 articles that our friend Jonathan Turley wrote. Because as we know, number one, he is no fan of Trump whatsoever, and he'll let you know that in no uncertain terms. He has some views of January 6th that we may not even share, because he does think that it was a lot more serious than certainly I believe. I guess you do. But he says, nevertheless, this indictment is crazy. I'm going to read a little bit of something. And to show how bad it is, even the Daily Beast, which hates Trump with a passion, they published Turley's assessment. And that says a lot. And so here's the crux of it. And I'm reading from Turley's piece in The Beast. He says, while the indictment recognizes that politicians are protected in making false statements in elections, he proceeds to charge Trump for doing precisely that, in claiming that the 2020 elections were stolen. Smith simply charged Trump, did not really believe it, therefore it's a fraud. So he didn't believe when he said it was stolen, he just said it, so therefore it's fraud. And Turley goes on, the implications of this filing were captured on CNN, where host Caitlin Collins explained, quote, the First Amendment does not allow the President of the United States to go and claim there was fraud, and when he was told there was not fraud, end quote. And Turley continues, that is of course entirely wrong. Just because you are told something doesn't mean you have to believe it, or that you cannot publicly contradict what you have been told. And I think that explains everything. Because he contradicted what he was told, i.e. the election was completely clear, because he contradicted that, he therefore must go to jail. It's crazy.
But they'll be the supervisors. If they made a mistake and overstepped their bound, there'll be supervisors there to guide us toward the correct position. and there were a few honest people trying to enforce such a silly rule. Everything that is done, what people are saying, nobody really knows what Donald Trump was thinking.
Yeah.
It's subjective. And then even if he sincerely believed it, he ought to be allowed to say it. It is really very bad. If they get away with this is going to be really. There's been some dire predictions, and I agree with the danger of what is going on.
So I've now read the indictment very, very carefully and very thoroughly. It is one of the strangest documents I've ever read. And to show you, to demonstrate how open-ended and broad this indictment is, I'm only doing this to illustrate. I'm not going to say it's going to happen or it should happen, just to illustrate. Under the terms of this indictment, Jack Smith, the prosecutor, could be indicted. Let me explain why. The core of the indictment is that Donald Trump lied to the public. That he lied. He just lied. But Jack Smith lied. In his indictment, he outlines the speech that Donald Trump made on January 6th. It's a very important part of the indictment. But he deliberately, willfully, and with malice leaves out the key words. He doctors the speech. He leaves out the fact that Donald Trump said, I want you to protest peacefully and patriotically. Peacefully and patriotically. Those are the two words that bring him within the First Amendment. Now, you can argue about it.
A great point that Dershowitz makes, that Smith himself lied and mischaracterized Trump's speech and could be indicted himself and should be indicted himself. Well, let's look at a couple of the quotes from his USA Today article. Jonathan Turley, because I think they're important. Go to the next one. Now, this is the article. Indicting Trump for knowingly false statements about the election sets U.S. on a dangerous path, is what Turley wrote yesterday. Go to the next one. Here is a quote from that article. He makes a good point. This complaint is based largely on statements that are protected under the First Amendment. It would eviscerate free speech and could allow the government to arrest those who are accused of spreading disinformation in elections. That is so critical because we talked through the entire COVID era. We were accused of spreading disinformation. Senator Paul was spreading disinformation. Dr. Peter McCullough was spreading disinformation. It all turned out to be right. Under this precedent, not only could they have their reputations destroyed, they could be literally put in prison.
But, this is very, very serious, but some serious things were going on with COVID, too. When you think about the people who wanted to challenge those individuals in government on what you could say about the virus, and literally to the point where if you were so old-fashioned, and I'm in that category about what I learned in medical school about natural immunity, and many, many parents throughout history knew about natural immunity, they then said, well, natural immunity, if you say it, you're done. And people did. They lost their jobs. So that opens up the door. If Trump can be penalized, could they go back and everybody else that spouted the same lies and the same opinion?
Yeah.
It should be the word opinion. Same opinions and what was going on. And I was also thinking about what about sorting out the truth in things like the assassination of JFK? There was a lot of lies and things told. At the beginning, it was almost universal. We knew exactly what happened. But now, the 80% of the American people know that is not the way it was. But back in those days, there was a little bit more tolerance of it. Not much, but a little more tolerance. Now, if this thing goes through, there's zero tolerance of people expressing their opinion, and it could spread. So even if it's just one person they're after, anybody who was a friend of so-and-so, even his attorneys might become, the victims too. That they can't. It just is. It's a cancer. Is what's going on here.
Don't be a sheep.
Why do we trust our shepherds for protection from our fears? Sacrificing civil rights for words we want to hear. Calling all good people in the name of liberty. Don't give up your freedom for your security. We've got to get a hold of this and get our heads on straight and shed this woolly suit before it's just too late. Spread the warning as our basic rights are lost. Freedom for safety is never worth the cost. Don't be a sheep, don't fall down for their lies. Aren't you getting angry? You're losing in this game. The government can take your gold, your property, your name. What kind of final straw is it gonna take to wake and smell the tyranny baking in the cake? Don't be a sheep, don't fall down for their lies. There's only one man standing, who responding to the call. The grand champion of our Constitution, the great one and only Ron Paul. Don't be a sheep, don't fall down to their lies. They're taking your rights. Don't be a sheep, stand up for your rights. Don't be a sheep, never surrender your rights. Don't be a sheep, come on, fight for your rights. Don't be a sheep.
Thank you very much for listening. Next time.
So the International Monetary Fund has said it expects the Russian economy to grow by 1.5% this year, despite the U.S.-led Western sanctions campaign against the country, which President Biden once vowed would turn the ruble into rubble. So the Russian economy shrank by 2.1% last year, but it has bounced back as Russia is adjusting to the sanctions. The Wall Street Journal on Wednesday called the economic war a stalemate, comparing it to the situation on the battlefield in Ukraine. So the report said that the sanctions initially made it harder for Russia to acquire microchips and other technical components, but Moscow then found sanctions loopholes through neighboring countries. Russia has also had no problem selling its oil as it's found new markets in India and elsewhere in Asia. The journal cited analysts who said the sanctions will hurt Russia in the long term. They're saying, no, we'll just wait and see how this is going to hurt Russia. But Russia continues to forge stronger ties and significantly increase trade with China. That's a big deal. And, they're increasing trade at a pretty rapid rate. And an alternative to the U.S.-dominated global financial system is slowly being formed by Russia, China, and other countries targeted with U.S. sanctions. The U.S. has successfully, in the past, U.S. sanctions have really ruined economies of smaller countries. This is the first time that they tried to do this to a country with an economy the size of Russia's. And U.S. sanctions on smaller nations are actually starting to lose some of their power because China and Russia are offering alternative markets. The next one here, Poland says that Wagner in Belarus is destabilizing NATO or plans to destabilize NATO. So Polish Prime Minister Mateusz Morawiecki claimed on Thursday that Wagner fighters were deployed to Belarus in an attempt to destabilize bordering NATO countries, which the alliance refers to as its eastern flank. So Morawiecki called the Russian mercenary force extremely dangerous and said that it had been redeployed to NATO's eastern flank to destabilize it. He estimated that there could be more than 4,000 Wagner members in Belarus. He made the comments with Lithuania's president, and they were meeting at the Suwalki Gap, which is a strip of land on the Polish-Lithuanian border that stretches from Belarus to the Russian enclave of Kaliningrad. The two leaders met to discuss the threat that they believe Wagner poses to the region. So if you're watching here and you see the map, you have Poland and Lithuania's border. That's highlighted in orange, and that land connects Belarus to Kaliningrad, which is on the Baltic Sea and sandwiched in between two NATO members. And, Kaliningrad is Russian. It's not territory. It's an oblast. It's a state. It's like Alaska is to the United States. And this was always a big argument against expanding NATO so far because, now Kaliningrad for a while now has been surrounded by NATO territory. And this was something Lithuania tried to cut off, transport to Kaliningrad, tried to basically put an economic embargo on that territory, but under pressure from big, I know Germany pressured them to lift it. Because that's a serious, provocation to Russia and something Lithuania, a small country like Lithuania, would never do if they weren't a NATO member. So this is the problem with giving all these war guarantees to these small countries. So the Times of London reported Thursday that the British Royal Air Force intercepted 50 Russian planes over Estonia in the past 4 months, while it led NATO's air policing mission on Russia's border. So the skies in the Baltic region of Europe have become a potential flashpoint for a direct conflict between NATO and Russia as their aircraft have had frequent encounters, demonstrating the risks of NATO expansion up to the Russian border. British officials said that there's been a significant increase in Russian military flights in the area since Russia's invasion of Ukraine. British Defense Minister Ben Wallace said, quote, "Hundreds of RAF pilots and personnel have spent months away from their families working around the clock alongside our allies to keep Europe's skies safe," end quote. So the British Royal Air Force had been leading this NATO mission since March, and now it handed it off to the Spanish Air Force. So if you're watching here, you see this map of Estonia, and this is the area that borders Russia, and there's also this big lake that has part of the border. And I know that I think a lot of these intercepts happen over this lake. The U.S. might put troops on commercial ships in the Strait of Hormuz. So this is, according to a report from the Wall Street Journal, it said that the U.S. military might place armed troops on commercial ships in the Strait of Hormuz, and the idea would be to protect commercial vessels from being seized by Iran, but this will really ramp up tensions if they do this, and it could result in direct clashes between the U.S. and Iranian militaries. There's a lot of questions about this. Are they just going to be, it looks like it's Marines that they're thinking about doing, or Navy sailors. So is it just going to be a few dozen Marines on a ship, and then if Iranian boats come up, what are they going to do? Fire on them to prevent them from seizing it? And then what happens then? It just seems so dangerous. And the U.S. has been steadily increasing its military presence in the Persian Gulf since Iran seized 2 tankers earlier this year, and that was provoked by the U.S. seizing a tanker carrying Iranian oil. So this is very important context that's not included in these other articles, mainstream media write-ups of this story. Using the pretext of sanctions enforcement, the U.S. Justice Department seized the Greek tanker Suez Rajan in April and forced the ship to head for Texas instead of China, as the U.S. intended to steal the 800,000 barrels of Iranian oil that it was carrying. But according to recent media reports, U.S. companies are hesitant to discharge the oil because they fear the reprisals from Iran in the Persian Gulf. And the Suez Rajan is stuck off the coast of Texas, and Iran warned American companies, don't discharge that oil or else. So, Iran has seized tankers before, but these current tensions started with the U.S. seizing this ship, and then Iran seized 2 tankers after that. So, that's just the reality. And since then, the U.S. provoked this tension, and now they're just started this military buildup in the Persian Gulf. So President Biden on Thursday called for the immediate release of Niger's President Mohamed Bazoum, who's been detained since being ousted by a military coup last week. Biden said in a statement commemorating Niger's Independence Day, quote, "I call for President Bazoum and his family to be immediately released and for the preservation of Niger's hard-earned democracy," end quote. So Thursday marked the 63rd anniversary of Niger's formal independence from France. So the U.S. has backed threats from a bloc of West African nations, the Economic Community of West African States, or ECOWAS. And the U.S. has backed their threats to use force if Bazoum is not reinstated by this Sunday. So that's their deadline. So it's coming up soon. And the U.S. would probably be involved. There's about 1,100 U.S. troops. There's 1,500 French troops in Niger. So this could really turn into something. So the Niger junta is standing firm in the face of pressure and sanctions from other West African nations, which has involved Nigeria cutting off power to Niger. And from what I've read, Nigeria provides Niger with about 70% of its electricity. So that means millions of people in Niger are without power. And Niger's coup leader called the sanctions inhumane and said that the military will not cave to the pressure. So they're not backing down. ECOWAS is saying that they want to use military action as a last resort, but saying that they're preparing for the eventuality. So it sounds like they're serious about it.
Here's Gerald Salenti with today's trends in the news.
Journalism is dead. Dead. Gone. Finito. Just the fucking little pieces of scum telling you what shit that the government tells them to sell you. So let's go on to the news. Oil prices perk up after supply cuts. Yeah, no kidding. Brent crude is now over $85 a barrel. We've been saying that it wasn't going to go down all year long, and now they're saying what we're saying, is that we see it closing the year at $100 a barrel. What does that mean? Inflation. Don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. When all else fails, they take you to war. And that's, we think, is going to happen. If there is a war that breaks out between Israel and Iran, United States, Israel versus Iran, you're going to see oil prices go through the $130 plus, and it'll crash economies and equities. So, what else? Bank of England raised their key interest rates by a quarter point, 15.25% today. Again, you read your Trends Journal. We've been writing about what's going on in England and how the people are suffering so terrible, and how the scumbag fucking prick like that Boris ugly piece of scum shit Johnson and that Sunak or some shit, whatever fucking crap this clown that's playing prime minister is now doing. They caused this with the COVID war. They destroyed the lives and livelihoods of millions of people across the. Now with interest rates going up, and again, we write it in the Trends Journal, they got a lot of variable rates on these mortgages, and they're due. And now interest rates going up, they got to pay more as they're earning a lot less. Yeah, you're going to see millions of people defaulting on their homes. But don't worry about it. The bigs will buy them up, and the bigs will get bigger. And that 670 to 1 ratio of CEOs to plantation workers of slave land will only get higher. U.S. debt downgrade greeted with political anger and trading calm. That's the headline from the Financial Times, and this is Fitch Rating downgrading U.S. Debt on yesterday, or Tuesday, I should say, late Tuesday, and it's not going to bring down the people. Still going to buy the treasuries. I mean, they downgraded it, but it's still AA plus, you know, and. But what it really signals is the beginning of the end. And this is what we've been saying, the death of the dollar. And your death of the dollar is going to come when they lower interest rates. And that's going to happen. Fitch also expects the general government deficit to rise to 6.3% of gross domestic product in 2023, up from 3.7% last year. So this is serious. And again, it's the world, much of the world is tired, not only of the United States geopolitical hegemony, but also the economic hegemony. They had enough. And this is just the beginning of it. Investment by China in overseas resources nears record. Very important. The first half of this year, Chinese investments and new contracts in mining and metals sector topped 10 billion, according to a report from Green Finance and Development Center in Fudan University in Shanghai, as reviewed by the Financial Times. You see what they're doing? The business of China is business. The business of America is war. While the Chinese are investing because they're getting all these precious metals that they know they're going to need, and investing in all these Asian and African and other and Latin American countries. What does the United States do? We need more military bases. We're sending weapons to Taiwan. We're sending weapons to Ukraine. We're stupid fucking shitheads. Hey, look at the cover of your current trends journal. All right. The American way, left and right, they're both out of their minds. Or we should say they're out of their fucking minds. These are the people that have destroyed this nation with the military-industrial complex as China, Belt and Road Initiative. Yes, some countries don't like it, like Italy, they got that little baloney Maloney in there. Another little war freak. Hey, Maloney, you like the Ukraine war? Hey, baby cakes, put on your drag and go fight over there. Bullshit. You're all bullshitters. Anybody that supports the war, go over there and fight, send your money, or shut your fucking mouth. This is on CNBC. Unprecedented Canadian wildfires obliterate previous annual pollution record in just 7 months. So they got more pollution now. They're breaking records. Hey, you fucking scumbag, shithead, arrogant politicians up there. Oh, Trudeau and his wife broke up. Oh, yeah, wonder why. Because he don't know why. Anyway. Oh, Canada that just went over to the Taiwan Straits with the United States. You can't put out a fucking fire. You're too fucking stupid to put out fucking fires. These are the shitheads that we got running and ruining our lives. Get rid of those incandescent light bulbs. Can't have them anymore in America as they're fucking polluting the fucking planet with these fucking fires that are going over to Europe. And the scumbag, arrogant bastards and bitches can't put out a fucking fire. Oh, speaking of which, this is an article in the toilet paper today. COVID cases on the rise in New York. Despite the uptick, several epidemiologists expressed doubt that there would be a major wave in cases in the coming weeks. Blah, 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 blah. Epidemiologists cited several factors, you ready? Likely contributing to rising transmissions. Okay. They're giving you now factors of why COVID cases are going up. Write this down, boys and girls. Including a few days of scorching heat that kept many people indoors. Wait a minute. Kept many people indoors? Hey, the fucking Cuomo, that arrogant scumbag over there in California. Whitlis Whitmer, Gavin Newsom, that arrogant prick, the fuck who closed down everything while he's partying at the French Laundry. Stay in your house, you dirty louse, stay in your house. Hey, wait a minute. If I stay in my house, it says right here that epidemiologists cited several factors, including a few days of scorching heat that kept many people indoors where respiratory viruses spread more easily. Wait a minute. Why the fuck did you tell us to stay home if the virus spreads more easily? Which we wrote about in the Trends Journal as it was happening. That arrogant fucking prick, Andy Cuomo, the daddy's boy. My daddy was Mario. I renamed the Tappan Zee Bridge after him and charged you $30 million, you stupid fucking shitheads in New York. He said, more people are dying that stayed home, that went to the hospital. Yeah, no fucking shit. But yet they forced kids to go home, closed down schools, fucked up everything. And now but they don't mention that in the article. We do in the Trends Journal, and that's why you subscribe.
You're listening to Part of the Problem on the Gas Digital Network.
because the fucked up thing about the accusation of a dog whistle is it's kind of like, it's like a get out of argument free card for progressives, because now you don't have to deal with what your opponent is saying. You don't have to respond to what they're actually saying. Instead, you get to decide what they're really saying, i.e. what they didn't say, but you've decided they mean. And now you can just take on that. So if you say, and you see this is done all the time. If you say, like, you want stricter immigration controls, okay, well, that's just a dog whistle to white nationalism or something like that. If you know what I mean? If you say, like, any comment you make that challenges progressive orthodoxies, they can now say, well, what you're really doing is you're trying to dog whistle to other bigots. See, you won't come out and say it, but I know deep down that's what you really mean. It's a very underhanded tactic that is, I gotta say, shockingly effective. Like, if you think, Rob, about it, because if you think about how deep this problem is, right? What if you were to go onto like a college campus? Let's say you were invited to like a typical, like, kind of progressive college campus and speak to young people, and you were to tell them, like, why you're a libertarian. It's not that they would hear your arguments and then be like, well, we disagree with this because of XYZ. It's not even like they're programmed with arguments that counter your arguments, and so they'll just regurgitate those arguments. It's much worse than that. They've been trained to, as soon as they hear you say this, start to decide what you really mean by that. You know what I mean? It's like they've been trained to go, oh, what you really mean is that you're a bigot, rape apologist, or like whatever the buzzword term of the day is. Like, that's like how devastating propaganda really works, or like how propagandizing people really works, is that you train them, like, this dog whistle mentality is a big part of it. You train them to not even hear what the person is saying, but to hear certain key triggers and then decide what they're really saying. You can see this all the time. Like, if you go watch any of those things where like speakers are protested on college campus, just look at it. Like, that's what you're seeing. You're seeing them respond to what they've been programmed to believe the person is saying, rather than anything that the person is actually saying. And that's whether you agree with that person or not is kind of immaterial. Just notice the dynamic. I mean, I see this with like Ben Shapiro when he used to go to college campuses. I don't agree with Ben Shapiro on a lot of things, but you could clearly tell these kids, they're not even hearing him. They're not even hearing what he has to say. They've immediately already decided, like, and that's why you have them sitting there calling him a Nazi, even though he's like got a yarmulke on. You know what I mean? And like, you're like, dude, does that didn't fuck with you at all? And they're like, nope, we already know he's dog whistling. It's a very, very dishonest tactic, and incredibly effective. There's really no other way to spin this story. Clearly, Joe Biden was lying through his teeth when he said, I never discussed business with my son. They obviously had discussed this business. He had been on phone calls with them. He had met people who he was doing business with. So it's bad for the Bidens, but that won't stop MSNBC from doing what MSNBC does. Let's check it out.
Times have been remarkably candid about saying, and we don't have it yet. And even Speaker McCarthy last week sort of pushed back against this impeachment inquiry momentum, because he was like, look, we don't have evidence to go that far. And as far as Hunter Biden goes, there's no doubt. I mean, it's pretty clear, even those close to the Biden family suggest that some of his behavior is pretty unseemly. That doesn't make it illegal. And it also means we don't know the role that then Vice President Biden may have played. And it seems like, no, they haven't proven that he had anything to do with it. They haven't proven that he profited from this at all. Yet maybe he is guilty of turning a blind eye to some of his son's behavior. And we should put this in context. This is a time when Beau Biden, the president's other son, was ill and then dying and then passed away. So perhaps he was not as attentive to what he should have been here. But again, there has simply been no evidence, Gene Robinson, no evidence at all that he was profiting from this.
Pause it there for a second. It's I don't know. It's so blatant, right? Just like the tricks that they use, where it's like, okay, so why is it relevant that his other son was sick at the time? It's not at all. But he's just going to insert that. And this is like the hard news guy. This isn't like someone coming in with some commentary. He's like, let me break down the news. Here's the news. He had a sick kid. Did he turn a blind eye? I mean, yeah. Is it unseemly? Yeah. But we don't know that he profited from this in any way. By the way, Donald Trump, if you remember, was impeached over the Ukraine phone call. How much was any of this not brought up? No one at MSNBC would have said, but he didn't profit from this in any way. I mean, he didn't get an investigation on the Bidens. It didn't hurt his campaign opponent. Like, why would he do that? No one cared about what was going on in Donald Trump's life. No one cared if it was illegal, technically. You know what I mean? No one cared if it was actually criminal. They went, it was an abuse of power. It was that this is totally impeachable. And they went forward with the impeachment proceedings. It's just so laughable that this is what they have to go to. Well, first of all, he had a headache that day. And we've all had headaches. I mean, you ever have like a really bad headache before? They suck. All right. So he dropped the ball. He's Joe. It's just really ridiculous journalism. All right, let's keep playing.
Or that either of them committed a crime when it came to this. And we hear here from Comer and other Republicans, it's wishful thinking. They're trying to create a scandal when there's no evidence that they have one.
Pause it right there. This is, again, another thing they'll repeat. Now, listen, I think we're being fair in the way we assess this. And even you said that you're like, look, it's can we prove that he was actually, doing business or involved on the take? I don't know if we have that proof. But this idea that there's no evidence that there's a scandal here, that is just not true. That is just not true. I was on that. I did that debate with Clint and those two brothers. I'm blanking on their name at the moment. But one of them said at one point where I brought up Bobolinsky, Hunter's other business partner, who had told the FBI that Joe Biden was in on it and he was getting paid. He went much further and said, no, Joe Biden was getting paid. He was taking the 10%. And I brought that up at one point and he goes, okay, that's just hearsay. And I was like, no, it's not. That's not what hearsay is. That's eyewitness testimony. That's a very different thing than hearsay. This isn't hearsay. This is a guy testifying that he was involved in this scam and they were paying Joe Biden 10%. That is evidence. I'm not saying that's enough for a conviction. I'm not saying that's proof, but that is undeniably evidence. Let's say if someone goes like, you're like, okay, well, this guy's accused of murder and we have an eyewitness who says he saw him murder him. And you go, yeah, but that's just hearsay. I mean, we have no evidence that he murdered. No, that's serious evidence. Admissible in a court of law evidence. Anyway, so this claim that there's no evidence is just a flat out lie. That's not true. There is evidence. Is there enough evidence? There's an argument to that, but there certainly is evidence. And there's overwhelming evidence that Joe Biden lied through his teeth to the American people in order to get elected, which is a scandal that you would think people who pretended to be news would care about.
Because a major event occurred this week, and it's a long time coming because it probably could have been said years ago that the dollar and the bonds are being downgraded. U.S. bonds are downgraded by a major grading service, Fitch. They say, nope, no more AAA stuff, AA plus a little bit more. They have to be cautious. They don't want to cause a panic. But this is a significant event. But it's something that most people know. And I was mentioning it to Chris. I said, I think even the ones that act differently on it, they know what it is, but they have to figure, what's the market going to do? Today we're going to do this. So there's a lot of that short time thinking. But long term, it was very easy. Matter of fact, these kind of events, I thought much more seriously about way back in the early 1970s and even the 1960s because the handwriting was on the wall. And certainly when the Bretton Woods Agreement broke down, there was a severance of the dollar and gold and the definition of what a dollar was, that there could be nothing else than this. And when you think about the young people right now getting a job the old-fashioned way, getting a mortgage, buy a house, own a little bit of property, and also feel secure that you get a little savings account, you can earn some interest, that doesn't exist right now because the inflation rate is higher than the interest rates, generally speaking, especially back in the last 10 years. So that's made it difficult. That's why I think it's important to get the information, as much information you can get. It's readily available everywhere now, which is, I think, a very good thing.
This was there was some news this week about a credit rating downgrade for the federal government. And, I personally don't put much stock into credit rating agencies. Of course, it seems like the right thing to do, but it makes me wonder, are the ratings even still too high? All these A's still there? There's 30-some trillion in debt. We know the government can't pay the debt. It's all a matter of will they be able to service it? So I personally pay attention to big crony financial institutions, especially after, I'm sure we all remember the housing bubble. All the the ratings agencies, they had all these A ratings on the mortgage debt junk, and countless times when you go to like stock analysts, companies go under, banks go under, and you look at what the analysts are saying, and they buy. It's like they're no help at all, and it makes you wonder, when there is another financial crisis, and this system that we're in that's what it is. It's one big crisis, but then there's every so many years, there's a big financial crisis. Do you think that the analysts and the ratings agencies are going to warn the public, sell now, sell? Of course not. They're not going to do that. And the bottom line to all this is you cannot outsource your own thinking, especially not to these big financial institutions that are largely tied to the government. So if you forgo thinking and let other people, these people, do the thinking for you, you're very vulnerable, and when crisis comes, that's when the vulnerability hits you. So you can't, if you don't know what you're doing with your money, it's probably best not to do it. So you can't outsource your thinking, and that's what these ratings agencies and analysts are all about.
But there are other things that we can watch to give us a big hint as to what is coming. Chris has already mentioned the big one, and that is debt. where are they going to get the debt? Can they squeeze it out of the next generation? Everybody says, you don't. It's not right to pass this debt on to the next generation. And I've used those terms myself, but we're really not doing that anymore. We've given it to them. We've given it to a current generation right now. When you talk about, I want to build a starter home. Yeah, it'll be 10 by 12, and it looks like a big doghouse. So they're already suffering from it. So the debt is a big deal, and it's continuous. Anybody who's predicting that there will be another debt conference between the Democrats and Republicans, and they will plan to reduce it, and they will have to reduce the spending a little bit too. I mean, that's a dream. That's pie in the sky, and it's safe to say that we shouldn't expect that. It's not going to happen. People have been tricked into that for so long, and it's not going to happen. But the prices are the best thing to go by. I think the person that does the grocery shopping probably has a better concept and understanding of what inflation is. What happens when you mess up the dollar and prices for normal things like food and groceries, that goes up to the point where people can't afford it, and then you have a lot more poverty. It might even force people to live in the streets and things like that. So we live in very, very dangerous times. In a way, it's because the people who manage the currency and the economy, they were too successful in that it was working. And that means they conveyed trust to the people. It'll be okay. We really don't have to deal with it. But that trust that was put into this allowed the debt to get this big and the momentum to be gigantic. At the same time, the debt is unsustainable, and the confidence level is now cracking. And that's what it helped build it. Because there was overconfidence and false confidence, and when it comes, it's going to be very, very painful because the corrections have to be made. Under this circumstances, the debt has to be liquidated. If you're an individual or a company or whatever, and even in normal times, if you've overspent and ran up too much debt and you can't generate and you can't make your payments, that's the end of your company. There were guidelines there. But it's different when a government does it because they do something more evil. They incorporate the destruction of the money so that everybody is involved, in trying to figure out what to do. And then they are tempted then to go to the government and ask for some type of bailout, thinking, we don't have enough money. We can't even pay our bills. We can't pay our rent. We have to get more money. And then they do. And what has happened under COVID and all these other things, they get more money, a lot more money. And not stopping to realize, well, what's the problem? Well, the problem is there's too much money circulating for too long, and the money has lost its value, and producing more doesn't increase the value of the money. That's a huge fallacy. And thinking if we just pass out more of the Federal Reserve notes, people are going to be better off, maybe for 10 minutes, but it is not. It just is more debt and more malinvestment. It's real hard to get people to think about malinvestments, but that's when individuals and governments and everybody else does too much of something that looks like a good idea. And then you end up with empty hotels and empty houses, empty apartment building, commercial properties having problems. And see, the malinvestment has to be corrected. The debt has to be corrected. You have to return to sound money. And quite frankly, that is not on the horizon. But it has to be put on the horizon because there's going to be a time where we better think seriously about returning to those days when we had sound money and a little bit of common sense when we deal with our budgets.
Now, if you had a government that's committed to protecting your liberty, perhaps the situation would be different. But I personally have a problem with loaning money to governments like we have today. First, if I were to loan my money to them for one of their bonds, if they pay it back, they're going to pay it back with money that is worth much less, diluted money. So right off the bat, I'm being cheated, but beyond that, looking at if I were to loan them money by buying their treasuries, what they would even do with that money. First, they take it all over the world and destroy one nation after another. We talked about Ukraine as the latest example. Colonel McGregor did a great show this week on that. So they would use my money for that. And and at home, they would use it to propagandize me, talk about the weather and how they're going to fix the weather, propagandize me about their wars, about viruses. So I would be paying for my own propaganda. This makes no sense. Why would you do that to yourself? Why would you loan them money so that they could use that money against you?
We do know that opium was used by the Chinese, and the Chinese were not welcomed in this country. We do know that the blacks at times use heroin, opium, and the laws have been used against them. There has been times that it's been recognized that the Latin Americans use marijuana, and the laws have been written against them. But lo and behold, the drug that inebriates most of the members of Congress has not been touched because they're over there drinking alcohol.
Dr. Paul, he's a statesman. So why do they hate him? He was delivering babies back in 1963, and he just helped give birth to the baby of liberty. He's a statesman. So why do they hate him? He was delivering speeches back in 1984, telling you how central banks were profiting from war. Conspiracy nut, kook, lunatic, fringe, wacko. Those labels contain more arsenic than tobacco. Behind the counter of your drugstore, let us examine more judiciously the term drug war that perpetuates the inner city mob. Inside joke, inside job. The same people who ship narcotics now own prisons, and their mission is to fill them up and lock them down. Decriminalize all drugs tomorrow. There'll be less pain, there'll be less sorrow. That's the reason you're seeing the bullets flying in ghettos and little innocent children are dying. You don't know the man from a can of paint. To call Ron Paul a racist is to call me a saint. There's not a candidate that you can trust more. His face should be on Rushmore. Dr. Paul, he's a statesman. So why do they hate him? He was delivering babies back in 1963, and he just helped give birth to the baby of liberty. He's a statesman. So why do they hate him? He was delivering speeches back in 1984, telling you how central banks were profiting from war.